Crystal Charter, daughter of the Red Seal. Read and written by Rebecca Sewell. The Cave. She had wept her eyes raw, had run across her reflection until her lungs felt as though tiny daggers were carving them up. Then she wept more. Her fists pounded into the water as she screamed for help, only to see her own face staring uselessly back at her when the ripples stilled. With her back resting against the bed of bone-white stone, she watched how far the water would shudder when she stamped her now bare feet down. The delicate pale slippers that she had been dressed in when she had awoken had been tossed, a small lump in the distance. In moments of sensibility, she had rationalized it was a good move to mark positions in the infinite cave, but the reality was she threw them as far as she could in a dampened rage. Silence pulled her gaze towards the stars, drawing her in with their humming power. Whenever the urge became overwhelming enough to make her stand, she forced herself to run again. Emotions were drained away in her prison, but exhaustion remained. There was no way to count how long she had been trapped. More than hours. More than days. Or weeks, maybe. She sat still long enough for her dress to dry, fascinated by watching the fabric hungrily absorb liquid whenever she moved again. There was no thirst, hunger, or desire to sleep. Once, she forced herself to drink water from the basin, despite not needing to. There had been no satisfaction, no sensation at all, and she envied her gorged dress. Thud. The mirrored stars rolled across the ground for a few meters before stopping to match their overhead counterparts. Thud. The same distance. Thud. The same distance. Boredom found her on her feet, gazing into a thumbnail-sized star again. She couldn't remember standing up. Her hands cupped it, tempted by the unwavering light, pupils wide with temptation and bewitchment. Self-control inched her hands away slowly, and she took control of her body with a deep breath, to take a step back. Pressure brushed the top of her head for a fleeting moment. A low-hanging star. My eyes open in a lush carriage, for only a second before I squeezed them tightly shut again, long enough to see an old woman opposite me and her terror-struck face. The carriage is going far too fast. Not again, please, not again. I want to weep. The driver, girl, is he still alive? The old woman screams at me. One of her veiny hands clutches the worn seat in a withered grip, the other a post by the window. I scramble to grasp my own window post, threading my arm in to hold me against the bone-rattling bouncing. Do you know who I am? I spit out through chattering teeth. What of all the... Is he alive, girl? Hesse said the crossbowmen were waiting. A hard jolt cut her off. I don't know, I shrieked back. You just check. Then we are falling. The horse screams from outside the carriage. Everything's a blur of limbs and skirts. A world of spinning and jolting pain, splashes of blood. My arm cracks as the carriage is thrown one way, and my hand remains stuck in the bar that I had wrapped it around. Gore-covered bone juts out of the ripped flesh. It's happening again. I want to scream, but being thrown against the carriage roof forces the air from my lungs. I open my eyes briefly to see the old woman's head, twisted at a strange angle, tear through the carriage space towards me. Her empty expression shoots through the gap between us. The impact of her frail body is enough to knock me from awareness. I wake up, legs screaming in pain, as the weight of the carriage pins them down. I'd been partially thrown out of a broken window, but not clear of the heavy wreckage. I try to push myself up, only to find a blinding pain rip through me. My arm from the shoulder is twisted in the wrong way, bone snagging on the torn skin below my elbow. Thick blood darkens the fabric of another dress I do not recognize. Oi, the girl's still alive. We was supposed to stop both of them. A rough voice calls behind me. I can't move enough to see who spoke. I got it, answers another man. Help, please. I try to call, but my voice barely croaks out into a whisper. Seconds pass into an agonizing eternity, punctuated with throbs of pain. What's taking so long? Calls the first voice again, with obvious irritation. Bolt's bloody jammed, innit? Grunts the deeper, harder voice. Oh, never mind, I'll do it, was his response. A slender man strolls into my view. He's dressed in unusual clothing, not dirty or poorly made, but well worn. A huge knife in his belt. I know he's going to kill me. His eyes are too cold to contain even a spark of mercy. I know this from just a glance, and still, I cannot pull myself free. It's a shame. She's quite pretty, this one. Not often sent after pretty things. He complains to no one in particular. I want to mutter for help again, but I see a piece of carriage wreckage in his hands. A long, heavy piece that responds to his swinging grip and collides with my vision. She fell into a heap on the floor, shuddering. The horror too quickly evaporated away, leaving her hollow. Phantom pains continued to make the muscles in her arms and legs twitch. An ache in her chest told her she should be struggling for breath and crying with despair. Instead, she lay down, watching the thin strip of water before her catch light from the stars. The fingers of her restored hand breaking the delicate surface of the liquid. She blew a ripple from her cheek, uncomfortably resting on the flat, wet rock, and watched those lights flicker. Her dry sleeves sucked up the water like blood from her last death, making her shudder. What do you want from me? She whispered into the cave, setting the grounded lights dancing again. What do you want from me? She screamed into the empty space before her. Hours passed in stillness. Maybe days. It was impossible to gauge time. The stars couldn't move, and the sun never visited. She found herself staring into another orb, transfixed by its dull magic. She had occupied her time by hunting for the tiniest light hidden among the bounty of shining death, something to take the edge off the beckoning glow. Then watched helplessly as her finger flowed towards it. The beautiful sky is painted overhead, unmarred by even a single cloud. The rocky meadow stretches out in front of me, and the hooting of the other riders sounds all around. Riders, I think. I can't ride. The horse's head is flat, the wind billowing its mane into my face, and my instant reaction is to sit upright, arms and legs splaying in a panic of adjustment. I know it's the wrong thing to do as soon as I feel my rear lift from the seat. Then that perfect blue is below me, and the rocky green is falling from above. Crack. She lay on her back and laughed, a hysterical noise ringing out at the stupidity of it all. The crack still reverberated along her bones, from the unmistakable sound of her neck breaking, fractured fatally upon impact. She missed home. Not just her family, but people, towns, flowers, food, daylight, clouds, even the moon that illuminated the night sky. The isolation of her starlit prison would drive her insane with time. Already, the echo of her own maniacal laughter had fluttered around the cave and formed voices. Already, eyes were burning into her from a distance. Eyes belonging to a girl and boy of ethereal beauty who exchanged confused glances. I'm not mad, she thought, spinning onto her stomach to make the world upright, palms flat in the water. Not yet, at least. They're real people. She rushed to her feet and they vanished. She twirled around, fearing they had disappeared like the voices. Relief, they were stood fractionally closer, both watching her with an intense curiosity from the other side of her stone bed. The lifelong instinct to straighten her gown and neaten her hair kicked in. It made another dark laugh escape her lips. "What do you say to the first witnesses of your nightmare?" she thought. Her mouth opened. "Hello." Chapter 19. Riding an unfamiliar ship home alone had felt like an unjustifiable form of torture. Imprisoned aboard a strange and uncomfortable vessel, with nothing but vast, calm water around her. That sense of freedom from a few days prior, now separating her from the one place that she wanted to be. Maebe was given a tiny cabin, with 2 stacked bunks, and enough space to turn in a circle if she pinned her arms in. Not even a window to offer her a slice of light. She had banned the other inhabitant of the cabin, cursing and raging until the captain had asked her first mate to spend a few days in a hammock below decks. They weren't hauling much merchandise, so Maebe couldn't see the problem. Captain Hark had collected Maebe from Clest with the most modest ship in the Red Seal fleet, the Sylph's Tale. It was the smallest but fastest of the merchant ships that her family owned, often used for last-minute purchases of medicine from the more treacherous villages in the north of the Main. The Sylph's Tale had been bound for Clest with the remainder of non-essential borderlines that the Emoto couldn't carry. But the crew hadn't had a chance to load everything before they were instructed to set off and retrieve Maebe under orders from the king. Everybody aboard had offered condolences or appeared to be going about their work in a melancholic state. Yet she could not shake the feeling that when they docked, her father would be waiting on the shore, his disapproving face mouthing the words, "You must learn your duty." A cruel punishment for her going to Clest, but at least he would be alive. Locked away in her cabin, Maebe swung between disbelief and crying until her eyes were red. On the rare occasions when she was on the deck, she pivoted between despondent silence, sore eyes staring forward into the blue distance, or snapping at the sailors carrying her home. Home, where her father's cold corpse lay. Spaceth Manor, flustered with panicked servants who had dealt with the visitors and mourners as best they could. Certainly had hidden away with a guard on the door, preventing uninvited guests from seeing her. Word of a murderer entering the home of the Red Seal Navarch was the gossip of Elpis. People even crowded the docks by the Sylph's Tale when Maebe disembarked. She had been informed that the head guard and 2 others who were on duty when the murder took place were currently in the palace dungeons awaiting a brutal trial. The king had reacted with fury upon hearing the news. Cold had seeped into the roots of her home. Everything had the chill shadow of death hovering over it. Every item held a memory of what she had, what she would never have again. The whole manor was now hers to maintain. The fleet, crew, servants, incomings and outgoings, the responsibility. Certainly appeared on the stairs the moment the carriage pulled up to the front. Wherever she had been hiding had a view of the entrance gate, it seemed. She descended the last flight of steps to the first floor and attempted to embrace Maebe as she walked through the aged oak front. Maebe tossed her cloak at her, as if she were a servant or a wooden stand. Instead of acknowledging Certainly, who now looked defeated by Maebe's instant callousness, she called to Jorgen, in a voice as cold as morning frost. She wished to be taken to her father this second. She needed to see his lifeless body, to believe the world could crash down around her with such indifference. Maebe's lip quivered as they walked past his ground floor office. The sturdy door was left open. The unlit fireplace and tidy desk killed the small, childish hope that he would be sat at work. A frown creased her brow as they passed his personal chambers and walked towards a guest room that had been shut off for years. It had been open when her mother was alive, when they held vibrant dances and meals. The 2 downstairs guest rooms were saved for the least welcome of the company they invited. Only after her father twisted his legs had the lavender suite been converted into his chambers. She stood at the door. Jorgen waited patiently for his mistress to indicate that she was ready to enter. "Why is he in the Navy suite?" She spat after a moment's delay by the closed door. The wooden panels pulsed with the significance of what laid beyond them. Before Jorgen could respond, a small voice twittered behind her, sending a raw ripple of annoyance along her spine. "We had a lot of visitors, May. And then they were so used to going into your father's office, so I saw a few of the important ones in there. Captain Hill came twice, and even Princess Morgana visited. Most wanted to speak to you, or ask questions that I didn't want to answer until you were back," certainly stammered from behind her. She was stood a few paces back, with her eyes dropped to the floor, as if she was taking in the details of the tiles, thumbs twisting around one another. Maebe spun on her. "But why would you not keep him in his office, near everything he loved, with his portrait of mother, with his life's work? You thought stuffing him into an empty room far away would be best. You could have used the drawing room for those meetings." She needed the anger. It stomped on the fear of entering through those 2 thin doors. "Forgive me, Miss Sumine. I suggested this room, as it has easy access but is quiet enough for a peaceful morning. I assumed you'd need to use the office when you arrived, and would have preferred it to not be occupied. And the drawing room was where we found him," Jorgen interjected, across Maebe's fury. She twisted back to meet her servant's eyes. A man who had worked for her family since before she was born. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she trembled as she understood what he meant. She took a moment to compose herself, and turned back to face the smooth wooden panels between her and misery. "Well, open up then, let's be about it." Her tone was clipped. Jorgen pushed the doors inwards, standing just inside with his hands still resting on the handle until Maebe stepped fully into the room. The chamber was dark due to the huge windows being covered with the heavy night blue drapes pulled over tight. The light of the beautiful day outside pushed against the silk barrier, but only succeeded in casting a cracked glow on the ceiling and floor. Maebe's breath snagged. Her lungs shriveled and deflated as she saw the dark wooden box in the centre of the room. Flowers on 2 tables on either side, heavy with scents that would mask the smell of death. Useless crystals emanated magic designed to preserve the hollow body between them. Jorgen vanished back through the door, mercifully remaining silent when he noticed the heavy tears that flooded down his mistress's cheeks. Maebe straightened her spine and lifted her chin against a mind heavy with guilt. Only 1 week ago they had argued in his office, and she had lashed out at him like a wild viper. "May?" That timid voice behind her spoke, just a choked whisper. She was unaware that Certainly would be foolish enough to intrude on this moment. She heard as Certainly's slipper brushed the floor as she took a step further inside, invading Maebe's grief. "Get out?" Maebe whispered, hot tears stinging her eyes. "If you need—" "I said get out!" Maebe screamed at Certainly, making her cower. "How dare you be here? You do not belong here. Get out!" her hands clumsily grasped the nearest vase of flowers, and she hurled it to the floor near Certainly's feet. Certainly scurried out of the room like a scolded dog. Maebe focused on her breathing. In, out. In, out. Minutes passed until she gathered enough focus to creep closer to the dark wooden box. Taking in the glinting crystals at the top and bottom of the casket, she shuddered at the comparison to the preserved meals laid out for her in Clest. Each step made her body weigh more, until she grasped the edge of the wood. Peering inside, she fixed onto the details of his face. The grey hue of his skin, the grazes along his jaw and eyebrow, evidence of the struggle he faced. His clean clothes that hid the damage that had been done underneath. On the journey across Moonay Gulf, Captain Hark had taken Maebe into her tiny cabin and given her a few of the details about her father's murder that they knew. He had been killed on the night after she had left. There had been sounds of fighting downstairs which had woken one of the maids. She hurried to get help from one of the ground guards by yelling out of a window, but when they arrived, her father had been face down on the floor. He had been ripped from his chair and slumped in an awkward pile of limbs, multiple knife wounds around his torso, bleeding onto the carpet like a crimson shadow. Lady Taru was unharmed during the attack, although she did get into the room before anyone thought to stop her and fainted at the sight, the captain informed Maebe, even though she hadn't asked. She thought the anger would evaporate from her when she looked into the coffin. She expected the bruised, bloated face of her father to fill her with an unquenching sorrow, but it just fueled the fire that had been lit at Certainly's intrusion. I only went away for a little bit, not forever. I was going to come home. You left me, she murmured through the burning tears, sliding from her cheeks down onto his waistcoat. How could you leave me? She yelled at his unresponding body, smacking her hand into the wood. The pain jarred through her knuckles, and she cradled it to her chest, falling to her knees with her forehead resting on the side of his casket. She cried louder than she thought possible. Anger, guilt, and sorrow blended into a flawless mixture of heartache. Maebe was alone in the tomb of her home. The evidence of her father's struggles had been magnified through a trick of her tears and etched into her last memory of his face. Chapter 20. Tap, tap, tap sounded gently on the door of Maebe's room. She assumed Elsie was coming to inform her that the bath was ready. Darkness lurked behind her curtains. She had slept from the afternoon to past dusk. Maebe scowled at the night, at its cyclical arrogance. I guess Elsie didn't want to wake me then, she thought. Come in, she called hoarsely. The light crystal beside her flared brighter when she placed a hand on it. 2 shining daggers were laid on the small table, waiting for her to decide where to put them. There was no need to hide them away from anyone anymore. Jorgen entered the room on his toes, silent as shadow. I'm terribly sorry for the intrusion, Miss Sumine. We wanted to let you rest after such a taxing day, but a message arrived, and I thought it best to bring it to you at once. His voice was almost a whisper, cutting through the silence of the house around them. Of course, Jorgen. I trust your opinion as to which messages are deemed important enough at this time. Someone from the Sumine 3. She held a tremoring hand up, waiting for him to cross the room and pass her a scroll. The shaking of her body reminded her that she hadn't eaten all day. Instead of a letter, a small red crystal appeared in the man's palm. The palace. Her voice cracked with realization. "I'll leave you to read it in privacy." He placed it in her hands and left through the door. His absence made the large room unbearable, a feasting hall with no guests. Maebe held up the crystal, turning it over between her fingers and staring into the broken shades of red. "You are strong enough to handle this," she reminded herself with a deep breath. With tired caution, she made her way out of her room, brushing her hand over the wall of light crystals to leave a dim glow waiting for her walk back. The finger-sized message shard gripped tight in one hand, with a crystal light attached to a short staff held aloft in the other. Soft scuffs of her slippered footsteps whispered around her as she tiptoed down the stairs of the hollow manor to her father's office. Her office. Melancholic curiosity possessed her at the bottom of the landing, and she diverted, heading in the opposite direction towards the drawing room. The door was closed. A sprig of white asphodel in the centre of a nettle wreath, held together by a string of pearls, was hanging from the handle. The maids had likely worked together to make it, to allow people to think twice before entering. With a touch of her pale fingers, the door creaked open. A gentle movement, to avoid being stung. The noise echoed through the hall and ran a nostalgic shiver up her spine. She didn't cross the threshold. Couldn't. Instead, she touched the crystal to increase the light and held it out in front of her. The glare reflected on the windows opposite and lit the room with harsh, angular shadows, dancing around as her hand moved. She winced at the brightness. Sudden panic flared in her blood as she heard a scuff of shoes. After a moment of hearing only her own heartbeat, she released a breath. "Stop being so jumpy," she muttered to herself. "It's just the wreath brushing against the wall as the door moved." One bookcase had been cleared of statuary and ornaments. The floor was bare of rugs, and 2 of the chairs were missing. Even from where she stood, she could tell the floor had been scrubbed to newness. Magic would have been used to remove any stains. It was a soulless evaluation she gave the room, an assessment. But she still couldn't convince herself to step inside until it was daytime. Sighing through her nose, she reached in to pull the door shut and headed back towards the office. Her father's globe cast starlight around the office. Mesmerizing shapes of moving night sky. She rested her light on the desk and began to rummage for blank paper in the drawers. A list sent from the Artificer Guild quartermaster of requested items was left blank on the back, so Maebe let the crystal spill its contents out. "Many condolences on the loss of Navark Seldom Sumine, your father. I heard you arrived from Clest this morning. I hope you have used today to rest after your travels and have started to take any necessary arrangements. Tomorrow morning you are to attend the palace to discuss your journey to Camulus in order to collect the burden. Sumine 3 sets sail in 5 days, as scheduled. We must see to it that Navark Seldom's funeral has taken place and that you are ready to assume control. How you wish to run the business of imports is at your discretion, as long as the burden is collected and safely in Elpis before the end of summer, annually. King Jasik, ruler of the Green Kingdom, protector of the swamp border and wall defender." The king had given her 5 days to bury her father and take up the role of Navark of the Red Seal Fleet, to sign her name on the Red Seal contract. Steps in the hallway disturbed her from a dumbfounded shock. "Jorgen?" she questioned the air. "Hello?" Servants crept through the house at all hours, going about their tasks. No response. One of the guards trying to find the kitchen for a break, she willed. Logical reasoning ran through her head, but her heart pounded faster, knowing her father had been murdered. She picked up the light and headed for the door, leaving the paper out on the desk to deal with in the morning. Fear dominated rationality, leaving her with the sounds of blood pulsing in her ears as she peeked her head into the hallway. A white figure, dressed in a ghostly gown, stood a few paces down the hall. Maebe's heart pounded furiously on her ribcage, like it was trying to pummel its way out and abandon her to a bloody fate. The figure turned, doe-wide brown eyes looking terrified. "Sir," Maebe exhaled. "I heard a noise. It must have been you." She visibly relaxed upon seeing Maebe. Then, as if remembering the last time she saw Maebe, Certainly's back straightened, and she brushed her gown neater. A new type of anxiety controlled her. Maebe strolled past up the stairs, ignoring her again. She left Certainly to follow up behind her in the glow of her magic, or be left in the dark. Chapter 21. Maebe had been left waiting in one of the colourful chambers leading to the throne room. The tiled floor was designed to hide charged crystals. She knew they monitor her movement around the room, so a castle steward would be alerted if she left. The stone walls gave way to huge alcoves, stuffed, too full of green plants. One held a larger-than-life portrait of a long-dead Elar, whose judgmental face and beady eyes bored into the residents of the room. Maebe sat away from the gaze emanating from the disturbing likeness. She had never been anxious about being in the palace before. Whenever she had visited, she had always been a welcomed guest of one of the princes or princess, attending a meal with her father, training with their weapons master, or studying in the castle library. She now felt as though she were being summoned to the throne room like a prisoner awaiting punishment. Bile rose in the back of her throat and she swallowed it down. "The king just wants to make sure I'm doing my duty," she told herself. The door creaked open, and Maebe prepared to leave the painted stare of the long-dead king for the fierce stare of a king who, last time she saw him, she had offended by dismissing his proposal of marriage to his son. Instead, a familiar face, topped with lush brown curls stacked high onto her head, peered around the door and gave a look of exasperation. "Gods beyond, they've been keeping you in here. I was looking all over for you. You should have come to my rooms. Did Lady Certainly not tell you that I wanted to see you?" Princess Morgana announced as she walked in. The grin on her face fell like an apple to the floor as she took in Maebe's appearance. Tired eyes and black-sleeved gown. "I'm so sorry about your father, Maebe. They told me what happened." She perched on the bench alongside her, shaking her vibrant skirt straight. "Thank you for coming to the house. You must have brought half of the palace guards for it to be deemed safe," Maebe tried to joke. "I know they haven't caught whoever did it yet, but I'm sure General Nyla will have her witches find them soon. You know how artificers get when they want to solve a puzzle. They won't leave it alone." She tried to comfort Maebe, but her eyes brimmed with tears again. Morgana placed a gentle arm on Maebe's shoulder. "Not that his death is a puzzle. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that," she said, squeezing her and letting go. "You have nothing to be sorry for," Maebe blubbed. "I didn't know the witches were being used to hunt for murderers now." "Yes, well, father has been quite put out by the timing, and I think, he wants to help." Morgana grimaced and shrugged. "Oh, that's nice," Maebe sniffled. She stifled the few tears that tried to escape down her cheeks and took a deep breath. "Do you know what the king wants?" "Well, he's furious that your father was taken from us like that. And sad, I guess. She shrugged. Mostly he just wants to see for himself that you're back in the city and ready to go south next week. He doesn't care about the trading contacts. If you want to skip out on trading this year to shorten the trip, he won't mind. He just wants to know that you're making a full run down to Camulus to pick up the burden and do the blood offering. The princess smiled at Maebe, an encouragement to receive a smile back. Seriously, though, my father isn't even the ground yet, and he's making demands. Maebe groaned. He is the king, Maebe. Attempts at making her smile had ended. She was now playing her role as princess, not friend. It's not an argument I'd pick if I were you. Your family has made this journey for centuries, and you're the only one whose blood can be traded now. And your reward for serving your king is that you get to make your own fortune using the Red Seal contract. I'm not arguing, Maebe started. I know my job, but just let me be annoyed at my stupid loyal ancestors and their stupid short-sighted traditions, she pouted, trying to shake off the princess's intensity. Morgana let out a short laugh. Keep your head high. Just say yes, and let's spend the next few days sorting this terrible business out. By the time you're back from the south, we would have caught the bastard responsible, so you can spit in his face. With one last quick hug, the princess stood, straightening her long peacock skirt and waist cinch before she fluttered out the room with a too cheery smile. She knew it was kind that Morgana had visited to see if she was okay. Maybe wasn't at all popular in court. But she couldn't control the simmering anger that bubbled in her gut. Why is everybody going about their own blissful lives? This is hard, she sighed to the beady-eyed king. She stretched upwards and paced around the room, counting the time away until she was summoned. Morgana was lightly informing the king of everything they had talked about, so she would be presented soon enough. She knew she couldn't count on Morgana as a friend. She was a princess who put her duty first. Maybe it was time for her to do the same. An ancient map of Orades, the North Continent divided into the Green Kingdom and the Northern Lands, caught her eye as she was pacing. An alluring piece, rich with history, hidden away in a waiting room. Maebe clicked her teeth. It showed Orades before the gate connected the swamps of Green Kingdom to Maine. The wall hadn't yet been raised to lock out their magical neighbours in the northeast, and the whole of the Green Kingdom had an equal-sized wings, rather than the stunted east wing. Hundreds of years ago, the swamps hadn't existed. It was difficult to imagine. The witch wars had affected every country, but the Green Kingdom bore the most physical scars. The land had been ripped apart like a loaf of bread. Huge areas sacrificed to the horrifying Thrae. Humans, pawns in a war of magic wielders, had risen up against their lords by unleashing Thrae onto them. The insect race tore through witch and wizard, resulting in catastrophic magic-fueled terror. Once released, the Thrae spawned and multiplied, corrupting the earth in an unstoppable wave of death, humans included. In an attempt to sever the land from the bugs, a spell was attempted to rip the Green Kingdom to safety, abandoning the northern lands. Thrae thrived in warmer climates, so the opinion was held that anyone left trapped could retreat north into the mountains. Magic failed in separating the countries. The gods themselves were supposed to have blessed the first Elar with the power to rule using the era crystals. It had been written down in the history books as a gift for suffering under wizard rule for so long. Mined from the Royal Isle, with assistance from the artificers loyal to the throne, humans used the power to claim the Green Kingdom for their own, eventually making truces with the Artificer Guild and writing the Crystal Charter. The era crystals, no longer needed to protect against witches, were now used along the swamp border under orders from the king. And, after the Green Kingdom attempted to abandon the northern lands, the wall was built to separate the two ill-disposed countries, a prevention against another war. The Sumines had been chosen as a family that was unwavering in their loyalty to the human throne. The blood offering was a tradition that showed that a human king still had subjects willing to bleed for his right to rule. The burden, a gift to the human king from a magic country, to represent respect and to ask forgiveness for slaughtering humans. Lost in thought, Maebe hadn't noticed the young servant open the door and step into the room. "Excuse me, Miss Sumine. The king is ready to see you now, if you will." She raised a hand and gestured out into the corridor. The girl's navy livery was tucked into a wide belt, embroidered with the wings of the royal sigil. Of course, lead the way." Maebe brushed her clothes free of imaginary dirt. The black sleeves of mourning contrasted too harshly with the metallic stitches in her sleeveless jacket. But it was customary to change your clothing, parts of it into black, when you were in mourning. Maebe hated wearing black. It reminded her of her mother's death. They paced down one of the long corridors of the palace, grey stone carved into columns that arched overhead. Twisting vines crept from the outside and wrapped around the columns, in crystals that protected from the elements. Flashes of colour in the form of huge tapestries hung between every arch that lacked a window. Tall, dark doors with 4 huge faceted crystals on either side loomed ahead. Mouse had told her the throne room had enchantments cast, so when you passed through, you were bound to obey the crystals or be expelled using magic from the room. The 4 crystals prevented anyone from harming the royal family, lying to their liege, from using raw magic, and from being a creature other than human or witch. Maebe had never felt anything from the doors. No sensation of cleansing, no twinge of magic, or a pulse of loyalty flooding through her, as some had claimed. They swung open, revealing the high ceilings and more tiled floors flooded with warm light. King Jasik was resting on his brass throne, hunks of natural gradient crystal jutting from the back, reaching upwards towards the high ceilings. Advisors crowded on either side. Prince Jaciel was still in the palace, and his stern face mirrored the king's, boring into her from across the room. Starlings flapped about in the galleries among the spectators, twittering to one another. Most people who viewed the king's meetings from the galleries were waiting to watch those who tried to break the magics crafted into the door. The easiest to break was lying. Being levitated and flung backwards until the spell dumped them across the threshold was embarrassing, especially in front of a crowd. Maebe had watched it happen dozens of times over the years. It was considered more exciting if they knocked a guard down as they were thrown out. What surprised Maebe were the 2 visitors who stood out against the much-loved metallics and colourful crystals of the palace. Wrapped in furs and looking too warm were 2 heavily bearded men from the northern lands. Ocean blue eyes, filled with intrigue, stared at Maebe as she walked up the unending motley of tiles. In spite of her nerves against the crushing influence of the room and crowd, Maebe kept her spine straight and footsteps steady. At the bottom step before the throne, she dropped into an elegant, well-practiced curtsy. "Raise your head, Miss Sumine," came the gravelly voice above her. "As you wish, my king," she replied, lifting her eyes to meet his. The king was broad, bearded with wiry black fuzz. His hair was the same brown as Morgana's, but his eyes were like wet mud. They lacked the deep honey warmth his daughter had been blessed with. His skin was sun-kissed, as bronze as the brass crown sitting on his creased brow. He was stoic and severe as any human could be, intensified by the stern men who flanked him. "Condolences for the loss of your father. He was a good man, loyal man. He knew his duty. He did it well. You can be proud of his memory. The Sumines have always profited under the allowance to trade in enchanted items from the south. But your father made that undertaking flourish." The king's voice was monotone, as though reciting a script. Since you were allowed to forsake the previous year of trading, I trust your father believed he taught you enough to take his place. In regards to this, I assume you need no further instruction as to what your role is now. My father was indeed a great man, and he has done his name proud. I am sure you are aware that I have been instructed since early childhood in the contracts that we must abide by, and I feel I will be successful in my role as Navok of the Red Seal Fleet, both to fulfill my family's oath to you, our king, and to trade successfully without breaching the laws you so prudently placed on magic. Maebe responded with equal bleakness in her voice. As a Sumine, you have more duty to attend to than just organizing a merchant fleet. You have been given allowances from your position by my goodwill and faith in your father. Now, you are the last of your line, Miss Sumine. The king's voice scraped along her spine, and blood rushed into her ears. She knew this would have been a topic of discussion eventually, but she wasn't prepared to discuss marriage whilst her father was rotting in a guest room at home. But as it stands, you have a funeral to arrange, and a long sea voyage ahead of you. We can discuss what you mean to do about providing an heir when you arrive back from the capital. I trust you'll be prepared to leave within the next few days, the king demanded. Maebe paused, pushing aside her argumentative nature to calculate how much time she would need to arrange the funeral. She was filled with a desire to delay sailing so that she could reach out across the Moonay Gulf, and those living in the main that would wish to say farewell to him. Morgana's words rang through her head. She wouldn't class the princess as a friend, but she knew wise advice when she heard it. He just wants you to say yes and be on your way. This isn't something you can argue with. As you command, my king, Maebe spoke to the ground, cursing how weak her voice sounded. Then, when you return, we shall have a more private meeting to discuss how you wish to continue your line, he boomed. Not that I'm that much out of touch with the ladies of the court to think that discussing such a matter wouldn't bother you. He barked a laugh, which made Maebe jump. A few of his attendants chuckled along with him, but none of their smiles reached their eyes. Well, you may leave. I shall see you upon the arrival of the burden. Be sure to have it back in Elpis before summer's end. Maebe offered a quick curtsy, without looking up, and turned on her heel. She was conscious of the boring eyes on her as her feet clipped along the patterned ground. Something significant had happened during that meeting, something she had been excluded from. She had agreed to more than she knew. Chapter 22. Maebe resolved to go straight back to Spaceth Manor. Her mind was overwhelmed with the work ahead of her. How many people she would need to contact to let her father's friends and colleagues across the countries know he had passed. And how to inform all of the traders in the main she would be undertaking the trip this year. Many of the traders would be keen to strike new deals in their favour with the untested daughter of Seldom Sumine. It was expected, when the contracts were renewed under a new name, that each trader would negotiate a better deal, making small increases to their profits. Maebe had no intention of being cheated into poor deals. She was the Navok of the Red Seal Fleet, the first solo Sumine, and she was going to bring pride to her family's name. Upon arrival at the manor, she listed out instructions to Jorgen, who seemed pleased to have his mistress so focused. Maebe wanted the office prepared for her to work in, and to have enough writing equipment set out for her to compose personal letters to her father's closest friends. She would use a copy crystal quill, with a base letter to inform a secondary list of people, traders, acquaintances, council members, distant lords and ladies who made purchase requests in the past. Meeting with each of the captains of her trading fleet was high priority on her mental note of things to do. She needed to discuss what her father had planned for this year's trip, and what should be changed to accommodate longer discussions with existing suppliers. Maids were expelled from cleaning the office. Maebe decided to take a small amount of time to change some personal aspects of the room herself before she started working. She took down the painting of her mother and wandered through the manor with the intent of placing it to watch over her father's coffin, only to stand at the door of the death room, portrait clasped tightly to her chest. Tears threatened, and a guilty anger throbbed through her veins. After a while of being unable to summon the courage to move, Maebe rested the portrait against the wood of the door. Tears stained her cheeks, and she called herself a traitor as she began to tidy the rest of the office. She had to recall that she had always been destined to one day use that room, to one day move her father's work aside and to start her own journey. His trinkets were left behind the glass cabinets, an empty spot where her daggers had rested. Red Seal contracts and charter law books were left open on the bookcases. Maebe moved some of his personal collection to replace with her own from the garden library. It took several hours of work before she felt ready to begin writing. The vast desk of mahogany held inkpots, now within her reach. Dust-covered blinds had been taken down to be replaced with curtains at a later date. It flooded the room with long-absent light. The giant globe, which told her the month and the movement of the moon, dominated the centre of the room still, but its stars were muted in the glow of daylight. Her crystal quill flowed over the paper, neatly penned letters using new inks on fresh paper. Her mind went blank with bliss. May, is there anything you'd like me to do? Sarah told me you decided to handwrite a lot of letters. I could help you write some if you wish. Maebe stilled her hand, but refused to look up from the paper. Her grip tightened on the quill, glad it was enchanted not to drip, and she took a deep breath. Sir, I've been writing for about 5 minutes. I was starting to lose myself in a simple task, so that I don't have to think about the god's cursed life I'm tumbling into. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. No, you shouldn't have. You shouldn't be here. This is not your home. You are not needed in this room, nor even in this house at all. Shouldn't you be spending your time packing for Clest? I assumed you'd leave after the funeral, but you seem quite comfortable still. Maebe asked, dressed with a failing calm. I am still the lady of this house. Certainly dared to raise her voice, a fly daring to buzz closer to Maebe's face. Sumine's hold no titles. You might have married my father, but you still have the True name. The last time I checked, the Trues lived a long, long way away in the West Wing. They aren't ladies of Spesseth Manor. Maebe yelled in response to the irritation, fist slamming down by her inkpot. Specks of ink spattered the letter she had been penning. She ruins everything. Maebe had always wondered when Certainly would snap back at her. She had been waiting for the day. Certainly picked the worst time. You're right. I may not be the lady of Spesseth Manor, but when your father married me, and he agreed to marry me, May, he said this would be my home for as long as I needed it to be, and he promised me. Certainly's bottom lip trembled as she spoke, voice shaking. Just get out. Certainly turned her back to Maebe and vanished through the door, tugging it behind her so it closed with a heavy thud. Maebe clicked her teeth and waved a hand over the crystal to summon Jorgen. One more task for her mental list. End the intrusion of Lady Certainly Tarot. Mr. Scavier had been working as her father's secretary for the last 15 years. Calculating eyes, a fine nose, and pallid skin, paired with the way he sat behind his desk and watched the world, led Maebe to conclude he might have been a sickly lizard in a previous life. She'd never liked him. He lacked a sense of fun, which repelled her as a child. As an adult, she had never grown to care for him. But she would admit he was good at his job. Jorgen had sent for Mr. Scavier at Maebe's request. He would be needed over the coming weeks, especially since Maebe had to leave the country so fast. On top of the work required of him, he was in possession of her father's paperwork, including his marriage certificate and will. "I'm so glad you made it down to the house so quickly, Mr. Scavier." Maebe thanked him from over her desk without raising. "It would have been easier for you to come back to the dockside officers, but I'd been meaning to visit since I got word that you were back." He scowled at her from behind the tall new chair, but didn't sit down. "I'll make it quick, Miss Sumine. I have the papers you're requesting, including his most recent will, updated only a short while ago, during the month of the Traveller." His shrewd eyes fixed on Maebe. "He wanted to change some details to include his lady wife." "Certainly." Maebe's eyebrows shot up. "She can't own anything. This manor belongs to whoever is in possession of the Red Seal contract, and that has always been somebody of the Sumine bloodline," she blurted. Surprise took her that her father had once again excluded her from important information regarding his young bride. He knew it might upset you, but he insisted it was the right thing to do. Lady Certainly is to remain a resident of Spaceth Manor until a time when she chooses to remarry. "She is a true!" Maebe spat. Fingers splayed on the desk, as though she would push through it. "Yes, if you would let me finish. Your father was aware of the animosity towards Lady Tarun, and was certain that you would eject her from the manor, should the worst happen." "I guess he did know me well enough," Maebe huffed in her mind, moving her hands to clench them under the desk. "She has been included as a resident for her safety, as your father wished," he drawled. "As for her keeping her name, that was also your father's wish. It kept her separate from any attachment to the Red Seal contract, so she could retain some status as a lady. That way she could remarry into a notable house at a later date. That was always his plan. I have spoken to Lady Tarun. She's been informed that she is entitled to stay, and I suggest you do not make demands for her to leave again. Make peace with this, Maebe." He glared down at her, and suddenly she felt ridiculous sitting in her father's chair, too small behind his oversized desk. She could barely hear the words Mr. Scavier was saying. "You have inherited the house, fleet, contracts, and all the belongings your father had. There is nothing more for you to have. You are his sole heir. His only wish was for Lady Certainly to reside here." Maebe savoured the feel of each nail digging into her palm, and schooled her face to calm. "You are certain that there is nothing I can do to remove her from my home?" "There may be, but it won't be easy. Not legally, but you would be going against your father's last amendment. This is a large house, and you are away for long periods. I don't see it as the problem that you are making it out to be. The lady is young, and will likely move away within a year or two." The lizard-like, unblinking stare fixed on her, killing her argument. There was nothing he could, or would, do to help. "Fine," Maebe growled. The word came out between clenched teeth. "Since you are here, would you care to help me with arranging the funeral and getting updated with the fleet?" If she was going to work with him, she could attempt at civility. A subject change might make the man more pleasant towards her, and she had a mountain of other tasks that needed to be dealt with. "I can inform you that several of the military officers at the Genton War Base need to be informed and invited along. Selden procured food for them in Artium, and had it sent north every year. They will be sad to hear of his passing. Aside from that, no. I worked for your father, Miss Sumine, not you. The final paper I brought for you is my resignation." The man was a wave of ice water on a summer's day. She would have to find a new secretary before she left. Another important job for her that needed urgent attention. I only brought the papers you requested with me. For the rest, you should go to the dockside officers. You need to sign off on some of last year's, which were missed, deal with several complaints from captains, repairs, inspections. Of course, you need to visit the docks to assess what is most pressing yourself. He turned and strode across the office to the door. A servant with wide eyes fixated on the door as it opened for him. I suggest you find yourself a new secretary, immediately. I, for one, have no desire to work for a spoiled brat with no inclination of what work needs to be done. He lifted his chin, casually scratching behind his ear. Lady certainly somehow tolerates your presence. Maybe you should ask her for assistance this summer. Maebe felt as though she had been ground into the wood grain of her chair. Even after asking her father's vile employee for help, he mocked her. Is he being serious? His deadpan expression gave away no hint of his intention, and it infuriated her. She was swimming through her sorrow and fears, trapped under the water's surface by piles of paperwork, and there was only one face she could see through the damp pages. The empty smile of Certainly, who through some trick had managed to maintain her status as a lady through her father's death. Lizard, she sullenly muttered under her breath as the cold-blooded secretary passed through the door. He stopped momentarily before leaving, and she flushed, thinking that maybe he had heard her. She kept her gaze focused on his back in case he turned. A long minute passed in silence before she figured out how to respond to another crushing heap of bad news. One foot collided painfully with the underside of the desks, and the inks were sent soaring across her room by the flying of her hand. A cry of, "Curse fucking balls!" sounded through the manor. Chapter 23. The funeral took place the day before Maebe was destined to set sail. She hadn't found a replacement secretary to organise the work that would pile up for her while she was in the main. She had intended to visit the ships for last-minute inspections and discuss her plans, however minimal, with the captains, but she had done neither. The idea of work paralysed her, a life preparing for this moment, and now it had arrived. She holed herself up in her father's office. The future seemed a better place to leave those jobs. Sumine 3 would set sail before the other ships, and then be back by midsummer. The other 9 ships would set off at various intervals throughout the year to collect whatever she had arranged during her first visit, and perhaps additional items, if she trusted any of the captains to arrange them. She knew all of them by heart, but she hadn't the time or energy to think on it. Late next winter, they would all meet to discuss the following year, and discuss any repairs to the ships. By then, she hoped she would be ready. Her plan was to repeat her father's previous itinerary, and scrap his new one, which she hadn't thought to study. Discussing new arrangements and their existing trading contracts was something she hoped to avoid until the following year, and making new purchases was out of the question. Captain Hill visited to ask if she needed help inspecting any of the ships. She assured him that anything left this late could wait a little longer until she was back in Elpis. A list of last-minute requests from the palace and the guild had been left in the dockside officers, and she instructed him to distribute non-essential orders between each ship as he saw fit. Elsie stood, shadowed in the office doorway. "Miss Sumine, we leave for the funeral in 1 hour. You need to get changed," she whispered. "Gods," Maebe muttered, dropping a letter of condolence from Mouse. She didn't have time to finish reading it, but he had heard the news. She had vanished from Clest without even saying farewell to him. He seemed to be doing fine with the guild, as she knew he would. Days passed with Maebe engulfed in stress, fixed behind the office desk. She hadn't prepared an outfit for herself to wear, or even bathed that day. Washing as quickly as she could manage, she scrubbed ink from her hands and toweled her hair until it twisted into impossible tangles. Elsie brushed through the mess, using a comb carved from a single piece of crystal. It cut through Maebe's self-inflicted chaos, and was tamed by the silent maid into a braided and elegant, if damp, perfection. No time to dry it or try a new style. In the mirror, Maebe saw how it framed her face, thinner than when she had last looked, and the red gleam seemed duller. It was practical for the occasion, though. Her father would have approved. She informed Maebe with a worried smile that an outfit had been laid out in her dressing room. Maebe scowled at the new clothes resting on the long ottoman. Black skirts, with wide lace trimming the bottom. A dark green cinch belt in a similar shade to her ruined cloak. She sighed at the small loss and went back to frowning at the white shirt, adjusted to have black bell sleeves that covered her hands. The style was loved by the ladies of the palace, but certainly had a flair for making it look outdated. Who prepared the clothes? Maebe grimaced, already aware of the answer. Lady Taroo, mistress, Elsie responded, looking at the floor. The clothes looked ridiculous on her. They were suited to a woman with rounded figures, to emphasize curves. But Maebe's tall, flat figure and red hair made her look like somebody had tried to cinch a corset around the trunk of a birch tree in autumn. It would have to do, though. The ceremony was over in a flash of shaking hands, speeches, and exchanging stories that ended in awkward laughter, or the sobbing of somebody Maebe had never seen before. She hadn't cried. Her expression was unmoving in the face of weeping strangers and distant friends. Neither Maebe or her father believed in the gods, but his body was moved to the temple of Orid, god of the mountains and watcher of the northern continent. It was where all of her family eventually rested. She didn't know how she was supposed to respond to watching her father be moved underground. Crying like some others were. She had no tears, though. Only a cold, stained lump in her chest, like her heart had been replaced by the damp rag that had wiped her face clean of tears and been balled up deep inside of her, away from the rest of the world. Or anger. She was still angry with him for leaving her. There was a short farewell at the manor. Close friends visited to share quiet stories amongst themselves and celebrate his life. It filled the house with more people and witches than Maebe recalled ever seeing in her home. Borrowed servants darted between the foreign groups of friends and colleagues, and her own staff fluttered around trying to direct so many new faces about without causing any disturbances. He had been loved by so many, but none of them will feel his loss like me, she thought bitterly. A loose strand of hair fell over her face, and she brushed it away, sighing as the sleeves of her new shirt brushed against her cheek. Certainly hummed through the hall. Her dusky pink lace dress had the same black bell sleeves as Maebe. Her dark brown cinch belt was the same colour as her hair and eyes. She offered a sad smile and a warm hug to every person in attendance, singing her husband's praises as a kind, thoughtful man who did more to make her feel welcome than she deserved. He barely spoke to you, Maebe muttered to herself, leaving the circle that had gathered around her, talking about how unlikely they had thought it that Selden would remarry, let alone someone so young. The last of the unwelcome visitors streamed out of the door when the stars had come out to watch her grieve as well. Maebe's stony thank yous and gifts of tiny red memory crystals were passed into hands clutching handkerchiefs. Each finger-length shard she passed out held an image of her father, a token for those who wished to remember his face. After, Maebe headed to her room, rubbing her eyes. The unfamiliar tightness around her waist was becoming unbearable. Certainly Pot had passed her with a tray in her hands, giving every appearance of helping the servants tidy. Her father's words discerningly flared in her mind. Find a hobby befitting this family. And Maebe knew what would make her feel better. In her dressing room, she yanked her cinch off, throwing it across the room. Waste liberation mixed with annoyance at having to wear the ghastly invention in the first place. A gasp of relief escaped her as she pulled loose the tightly pinned braids. They fell about her shoulders, silver streak mixing with the autumn-blessed colours of her hair. She scrubbed at her eyes once more and set about finding something comfortable to wear, for scolding certainly. Mr. Scavier's visit had left her beyond frustration. Under no circumstance would she accept that certainly was allowed to intrude in her home, her life, even after her father's funeral. She wanted the woman to leave her home, without the guilt of betraying her father. She'd never understood why he remarried her. She never asked why. It seemed foolish beyond any reason. Layer after layer of mourning clothing fell to the floor until she stood in her underclothes, peering into her armoire. All the comfortable clothes were packed away in neat piles. She salvaged a pair of casual trousers from the heap of not clean but not dirty clothes. Stacks of tops filled several shelves, and she spotted several of the unworn tunics she had taken to Clest. Since the funeral was finished, she could abandon the black sleeves. So she recklessly yanked on a navy blouse with a red brocaded collar. The motion pulled the whole pile out onto the floor and muted the thud of something falling out between the tops. She pulled her selected shirt over her head, then carelessly kicked at the pieces, torn between putting them away and leaving them for Elsie to do. A shining glass caught her attention. A tiny, stoppered vial lay on the floor amid the heap of shirts, half filled with iridescent fluid. As she scooped it up, the liquid swishing around the glass glowed without giving off light. She held it up to stare into the tiny bottle. The potion from the hedge witch in the forest with Mouse. A memory potion, Maebe whispered to herself. She could wipe her memory of the past few days, perhaps of the last year if the era shard had imbued itself with it. That's a stupid idea, she told herself. But a memory potion. She turned the possibilities over in her mind. It was forbidden to have it in the Green Kingdom. Potions were allowed as healing treatments. Quality potions were made in the Night Guild, but the strained relations with the Northern Landers left a gap in the market. She had 2 suppliers of potions in the main, who traded with brews from Artio Forest nature witches. They were mostly energy boosters, or simple healing medicines that warded against swamp poisons, and sold directly to the military, to be administered only in the presence of a military witch. Potions activated on ingestion or application, whether the recipient consented to its use or not. That was why they were monitored with more severity. Crystals show an obvious use of corruption if used to injure, and raw powers are diminished if used on an unwilling subject. The rules of consent affected most forms of magic, but not potions. The swirling liquid hypnotized Maebe with its pulsing power. If certainly were to ingest a memory potion, maybe she would forget that she lived in Spaceth Manor. She might forget her whole marriage and want to return to Seacrest. If Maebe was lucky, she could even get her to start packing tonight. Even if she only lost part of her memories, it would be in her best interest to return home to her family. No one would be able to say I went against my father's will if the poor girl was having health issues. She tucked the round-bottomed vial into her pocket with glazed eyes and dashed down the stairs, knowing where to head. Chapter 24. Wistful laughter echoed from the kitchen. Maebe knew certainly would be in there, making a nuisance of herself as usual. She stalked the noise and flowed into the room like a predator, leaning against the door frame and looking down her nose. Certainly sat smiling with Sarah. Maybe his eyes bored into them, as intent possessed her actions. "Excuse me, Sarah. I'd like a word with Cert in private, if you wouldn't mind." Her voice rang hollow, like it came from another body. The rounded cook could have been Certainly's grandmother. They shared the same heavy bosom. Sarah's dark hair had turned mostly silver, and her brown eyes had more of a spark of life than Certainly's. She curtsied deep, in the presence of a mistress who hadn't ventured to the kitchens since she was a child. "Yes, Miss Sumine, immediately. I'll be in the servants' hall. I can keep the others from coming in, if it pleases you." She dipped her head again, wringing her hands. Maebe offered a sweet smile through glassy eyes. "That would be wonderful, Sarah. I won't be long. Please enjoy some of the delicious food that you prepared today." Confusion, rooted in her mistress's strange behaviour, led the old woman to cast a nervous glance at Certainly, before she bowed deeply and vanished backwards through the door. "Maybe No. Don't worry. I owe you an apology. I've come here," her hands gestured to the room around them, "to show you how sorry I am. You were the one who prepared the extra staff today, yes? How brilliant. The day would have been a failure without them. I thought we could have a drink and a chat. It's no secret that a lot has happened recently for both of us, and I think if we're going to live together, we should at least be on speaking terms." Her empty stare unsettled Certainly. "Okay, that does sound nice," she responded with a nervous whisper and chewed her unsmiling lip. "Look, I can even make tea for us myself. I'm more than just a spoilt merchant's daughter." Maybe had tried to make it a joke, but she heard the desolate tone of her voice. She was too distracted by the burning weight of power in her pocket. She scrutinized the room, trying to find a kettle to fill with water, and noticed Certainly pointing to one on the wall with a pained expression. Hanging among pans of every size was the metal kettle. She unhooked it and filled it with water from a crystal over the drain. A chunk of green barite, tapped into a spring in the north of the capital, opened to a flow of fresh water, a useful invention from the Guild that was much more common in Clest, but few could afford the maintenance. She placed the heavy kettle on the crystal-powered stove and went back to the high-rise table and the stool that Sarah had been perched at. Fingers brushed cautiously over the lump in her pocket. How would it work? Maybe she would lose her memory of the last year. That would be useful, but unlikely. If it did, though, would she just leave? Would she just go to her family? The witch had placed the era crystal inside it. It changed colour with the influence of the crystal. Instantly, her mind reneged the fantasies in. She'd never seen a potion treated with external magic. What would happen to it? What if she lost all of her memories? What if it corrupted the potion? Maybe breathed through her nose. It's fine. It will just be a little stronger than usual. Like the era crystals are stronger than other crystals. Are you okay? Certainly ventured, thumbs circling each other in her lap. I'm fine, Maebe snapped. She hadn't realised her stare had been fixed on the shy woman, shrinking further into the kitchen stool with every second that passed. You know, you don't have to lie. No one expects you to be fine. Not after today. You seem a little distant, maybe. Guilt was a hair's width away from wrecking her. She had forgotten her father for just a second. Her breath snagged. How could she have been so engulfed in what she was about to do? The guilt extended to how her father would react to maybe poisoning his wife. I've never lost a parent. I can't imagine how bad you must be feeling, Certainly continued. I'm so glad you want to talk, though. She smiled, an infuriating, pitying smile that lit up her face, and her back straightened a degree. Maebe's fingers walked over the lump in her pocket, and her eyes glazed over again. The kettle began whistling. Her mind was made up. She poured the steaming water into a teapot, brewing the most scented tea she could find, honey root with fire ginger. The hot, sweet steam filled her nostrils, and she knew with certainty it would cover any smell or taste the potion might have. She found 2 ornate teacups whilst it was brewing. A glance at Certainly showed her drawing invisible doodles on the table with her fingers, holding on to that pitying smile, even with sad eyes. Maebe fished the vial from her pocket, fumbling to pull the stopper out of the end of the tiny bottle. It pulled free with a small popping sound, and Maebe swiveled her head to see if Certainly had heard. She had stopped drawing invisible pictures to tap her fingers on the surface and stare into the distance. A shudder ran through Maebe as she tipped the contents into the bottom of the delicate teacup. Tiny spring trees wrapped around the edge. Painted pink petals swirled around the rim. Apprehension twisted her guts to ribbons, but didn't stay her hand as she tipped the steaming tea into the cup, covering the unnatural shine of the liquid with the brown mask of tea. Here you are. She dropped the tray down in front of Certainly, and her arms began shaking. Are you sure you're all right? No one would think it amiss if you went to lay down. I know you leave tomorrow, but I'm fine. Honestly, I just need a drink. She had to drag her eyes away from Certainly, and struggled to push the teacup towards her. Her hands had clammed up, and she felt her face burning the same way. I used honey root, so we shouldn't need anything sweeter, but do you want anything anyway? She stuttered. Why am I nervous? It's not right. I'm not murdering anybody, she thought. Her mind argued with itself. She could feel the sweat beading on her forehead, and she clasped her shaking hands together. Her body was protesting. No, thanks. The beautiful cup was raised to Certainly's lips, and Maebe felt her attention focus too sharply on the action. A starving mountain cat, seeing the minute movement of a rock rat that it would hunt all the way to the summit if it had to. This is wrong. She lowered her carnivorous stare to her own cup, waiting for something to happen, absorbed by the brown liquid steaming in her face. The sweet smell of honey root luring her to taste her own tea. Her hand shook the teacup, rattling it against the saucer before she could steady herself. She didn't want to drink honey root tea, not so late at night, and definitely not in the kitchen. Maebe hated going down into the kitchen. It wasn't appropriate for her to be there. She should have taken a soothing tea in her rooms. Today must have shaken me a bit too much to venture down here, she thought, and sighed out. Her hand steadied. Sweat dripped from her head onto the table. She pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at it. Do I have a fever? Miss Sumine, would you like me to get one of the girls to take your tea upstairs for you? The quiet voice of a mousy girl from the door. Lucette was Sarah's helper. She must have come to get something from the kitchen. I'm not feeling too well, Lucette. Could you have this sent to my room and tell Elsie to run a bath for me? After that, I told Sarah to enjoy the food at the servants' hall. You can go and join her. Today has been long for everyone. Have a rest, she sighed. The slim young girl bowed and slipped past Maebe on the stool, grabbing a tray and whisking the teapot out of the room. Maebe hated the kitchen. Dark stone walls, a trove of practical crystals and utensils. This was a respectable manor, and she had her own role as owner to sustain. When her mother died, Her father had told her, "Grief makes you do strange things." A wash of sadness filled her, but she nodded to herself in agreement with his distant wisdom. Maebe hopped off the stool to go to her bedroom. Her thin house slipper soaked up warm water splashed across the floor. Glancing down, she saw tea that she must have spilled during her dizzy spell. "That's why you get servants to do it," she muttered to herself. There was a single, dainty teacup on the floor, hiding from the shadows in the gem lights. Tilted and resting on its side, a small puddle surrounding it. It matched the one on the tray Lucette had cleared from the room. An unvoiced question fluttered around her brain. Why did you get 2 cups? Everyone went home, didn't they? She scooped it up by its dainty ring handle, painted to look like a twisted branch, and placed it on the top of the table. A glinting light snatched her focus back to the middle of the cup. Resting in the last drops of sweet-smelling tea sat a crystal. Dark. The kitchen was filled with regularly used magic. She assumed it was a near-spent gem of practical use. She plucked it out, holding it up to the light, where she noted that there were no shades of blue or green or red glinting in the depths of the stone. The crystal was opaque, black, tainted and spent. Her vision went as black as the crystal, which she clutched in her bloodless hand. Chapter 25. She's waking up. Elsie's shrill voice pierced through the warmth that wrapped around Maebe. She felt like a newborn, swaddled and confused at the world around her. In a hazy fuzz, her eyes opened to the safe familiarity of her room. Dark pink sheets covered her, and shapes huddled around the posts of her bed. Deep teal walls and white-framed paintings cradled her against a nightmare. She had to wake up. Every bone in her body was protesting. Something had happened, something terrible. The blurry shapes that took form when Maebe blinked, blanketing them in black before opening her eyes to a clearer picture. "You're right. She's awake," Jorgen repeated. His calmer tones did nothing to stop the dread twisting her gut. "What happened?" she croaked through an exhausted voice. As the words tumbled from her lips, memories of before she blacked out slammed into her conscious memory. "What did I do?" she screamed in her mind. "You collapsed in the kitchen, miss," Elsie chipped in, looking a little calmer than she had moments before. "It's been a long day. Perhaps a bit too much has been piled onto you recently." Maebe struggled to breathe. She closed her eyes to focus on inhaling deeply, but an empty smile appeared behind her lids, and she threw the curtains of her eyes open and fixed them on Elsie. "What?" she gasped out. "How long was I out?" Perhaps an hour, no more. We sent for a doctor. He'll be here short." "I'm fine. I don't need a doctor." She struggled to pull herself upright in her bed. The sheets tucked around her were meant to be comfort, but they were constricting. A sharp stab pulled awareness to her palm as she put her weight on it, but she daren't open her hand. Not with Jorgen and Elsie in the room. "I'm just tired," she lied. "Miss, you sail tomorrow morning," Jorgen reminded her, as if she could forget. "Then have the god's cursed doctor sent in the morning, so he can report to the king that I'm fine," she snapped at him. She wanted to be alone, and to look at what she was holding. If they had already sent for a doctor, then it was likely that the king was already aware something had happened to her. She knew she would have to see one, but not now. Morning was soon enough. As you wish. Do you need anything else before we leave you to rest? Jorgen asked. She wanted to be alone, but another need reigned up. Water, she demanded. There's some here, mistress. Elsie picked up a glass and handed it to her from soft hands. Big, worried eyes watched Maebe as she drank. Then Elsie refilled it and left it on the bedside table. Jorgen turned to leave. His livery looked crinkled from the busy day, but he had kept his silver-streaked hair neat. Jorgen, she questioned, and he stopped in his tracks. Could you send Cert in? He froze, lost in thought. I'm sorry, miss. Who? He frowned as if he recollected the name. But if it flickered deep down, it still remained untouchable. Lady, certainly, Maebe clarified with a husky voice. Was she someone in attendance today? His voice sounded unconvinced by his own question. Jorgen was dedicated to his job. He took pride in his life's work. Every name on the list of those in attendance at her father's funeral would have been stored in his mind. No, her gut clenched. I think I'm just tired. I'm not making any sense. She offered him a weak smile and squeezed her hand tighter around the object she was holding. Well, good night, miss. He bowed and backed out of the door. Elsie stood with a hand on the handle. I'll be in early in the morning to get you ready for the doctor. Oh, and a note came to say your bags have already been put aboard Sumine 3, so that's one worry off your mind. She ducked her head in a small curtsy and stepped backwards, pulling the door shut behind her. Shaking, Maebe raised her hand up to her face. Bathed with the faint glow of crystal light, it looked ghostly, pale, slim. One finger at a time, she uncurled her hand, tasting her sweat in the air. Crescent moons marked the flesh of her palm, where her nails had bit into soft skin. There it sat, in her haunting grasp, black as the night beyond the curtains, a tainted gem. She closed her fist around it again and clutched it to her chest, muttering curses. This moment couldn't be real. She would have never poisoned someone. Certainly irritated may be true. But she was unwelcome, breeze-brained, and provincial. But maybe wouldn't have chosen to hurt her. Would I? This can't be happening, she spoke out loud. Calming tones in her voice allowed her to muster confidence, the same she used on her horse when he spooked. This was all a bad dream, brought about by the weight of her father's death and her elevated position, a harmless fantasy that she had indulged in too far, and now it was time to finish it. Wake up. Come on, this is a dream, she repeated. Panic rose inside her, just a little. Her breath caught, and her brow twitched against squeezed shut eyes. Magic was used in the Green Kingdom to help people. It was the base of everything she had been taught by Charis and Hannah, everything she believed. Crystals allowed power to be shared. They were weakened against the unwilling and corrupted with ease when used to inflict pain. They were safe. Only, Maebe had used a potion. The swirling, iridescent liquid flooded her thoughts. She had seen countless types of potions in the main. Hedge witch brews of questionable quality, said to restore health, wealth, offset the effects of unlucky stars, restore the physical aspects of love. A potion for everything, and most of it stomach acid-inducing garbage. She knew from years of studying Red Seal lore that the best potions were brewed by the night witches, and many nature witch brews were of high quality. Even if she intended to do something to certainly, She wouldn't have used a knockoff hedge witch potion. Unless... It bewitched me. Her mind raced, thinking of what could have happened. The problem was that she had never heard of a crystal being used with a potion. She had no precedent to understand the effects of such a merging. The witch had said it was a memory potion. True. It seemed to have wiped the memories of Jorgen and Elsie, who didn't even recognize Certainly's name. She had forgotten her too, until... the crystal. She picked up the crystal. Her memories of Certainly had flooded back to her in an overwhelming wave in the kitchen, after she had picked up the crystal. Logic swarmed in her mind. The potion must have been corrupted by the era shard, and the crystal was the result of using that potion. But from that flaw, she could undo the magic she had unwittingly cast. That hope died with the idea of touching every person in the Green Kingdom with a crystal. It was impossible. Her room, though. The crystal may have erased Certainly from people's minds, but it can't have erased her everywhere. Where was she? Before she knew what she was doing, Maebe had charged down the hallway, the dark weight of the corrupted crystal clasped tight in one hand and a glowing light staff in the other. She flung open Certainly's door to find the ivory room, restored to its natural colour scheme and flocked walls, reflecting the gem light back at her in mocking patterns. It certainly hadn't changed the ivory room much when she moved into Spaceth Manor. She had placed her belongings alongside that which was already there. Her hairbrush had been added to the dressing table, filled with bottles and keep chests that had already been housed there. But her hairbrush was gone. Around the house she hadn't changed anything. She had just flowed into the empty spaces. Undisturbing but ever present. Maebe had resented her for it. But she had never intruded. The bed was freshly made with pale linens and gold pillows, and a thin canopy hung overhead with shining crystal tassel to aid a peaceful sleep by minimizing outside noise. The bedside table had once held Certainly's most valuable item, a flat slice of crystal, burned with magical images of her parents in front of her home at Seacrest. Gone. She squeezed her eyelids together, blinking away the nightmare. Just open your eyes and everything will be back in place. When she looked again, nothing had changed. Maebe yanked on the doors to Certainly's armoire, searching for any trace of the woman. It should have been filled with vibrant dresses, bedecked with ugly lace. But it was empty, waiting for someone to use. She slid down the wall, resting her head against the cold surface. Everything was gone. The power of that tiny shard had been enough. There, in the back, hidden on the bottom shelf. Not empty. A small parcel rested in the shadows. Maebe's trembling hands placed the light staff on the floor, and she crawled over to lift the package gently. She knocked over a moth crystal, which would have protected any piece of clothing shut away behind the doors. And she sat cross-legged on the floor beside the light and held the package on her lap. The seal was familiar. The ribbon holding it together fell apart and fluttered to the ground. Inside was the night blue cloak, the border rich with gold and silver needlework of constellations. It was the cloak Maebe had ordered for a protesting Certainly. A cloak she had never wanted, and never used. Ouch, Maebe muttered as she pinched her arm. She did it again, certain she was drawing blood. Anything to wake up. Disbelief struck her numb. In one hand, she held the cloak of a woman who didn't exist to anybody but her, and in the other, she held the crystal which could resurrect her memory, but condemn Maebe. Wake up! Cracks shattered the mirror that Maebe threw the crystal at in a fit of anger. As fast as she threw it, She was on her hands and knees scrambling across the floor to claw for the useless hunk of rock. Cuts shredded the tender points of her palms, still not fully healed from Elpis, until she found it. Heartbreaking sobs broke free from her chest. Summoning enough strength to crawl away from the broken mirror, Maebe cradled the black gem in both of her bleeding hands and covered herself with the night cloak, shutting out the outside world and shuddering under the embroidered stars. Chapter 26. Maebe had boarded Sumine 3 and announced to Captain Hill that she would be in her cabin. Only moments after announcing this, she had walked past the main cabin door, her father's, and the place Captain Hill had expected her to stay, and opened the door on her old bunk and desk. They weren't old anymore. True to his word, her father had had the room refitted, with the expectation she'd choose to join him. It hit her, like a fist from the voidland itself, right in the gut. The desk was new, bolted to the floor and wall with a tiny locked cabinet for her inks. A large strip of leather was arranged with artistic precision up a beam of timber to hold any loose scrolls she may have brought on the journey to pass time. Her bed had the same dusky pink sheets she had in her bedroom at home, but smaller for her cramped bunk, with new carved storage tucked beneath. A painting of Elpis hung above it, a vivid oilwork of the castle looming over the colourful turbulence of the city. Swinging vines hung beside it on a geometric metal flame, beset with light crystals. He had brought a little piece of home aboard for Sumine 3 for her. The door closed as fast as she opened it, and she threw herself into her father's cabin next door. One glance at her new accommodation, and she slammed the shutters over his modest windows, the dim light allowing Maebe to pretend the room didn't remind her of him. I can't do this. In the first weeks aboard, Maebe had hauled all of her father's belongings out and stored them in her modest room until she could make some serious changes. They had arrived in the first port of Nemain, a bleak town filled with the black-spired architecture of the country, called Ultis. Maebe had borrowed a few of the ship's men, and the second Captain Hill had brought Sumine 3 to dock, she had claimed them on need of urgent business. When she had returned to the ship from the town, the sailors trailed behind her, leaving small parcels in her cabin as she directed them. "What in the gods beyond are you doing?" Captain Hill exclaimed as he strode into Maebe's cabin. She held up a sticky paintbrush, fingers white from covering the dark-grained wood that her father had enjoyed. Maebe barked a response from under loose strands of paint-streaked hair, fresh smudges on her forehead from brushing it out of the way. "This cabin is now to accommodate me and my needs, Captain. I can't take another week at sea suffocating myself in here." Hill stood in the doorway, light hair tied at the base of his neck fluttering over his shoulder. Wind-chapped cheeks flushed with long-suffering bewilderment as he grimaced at the last Sumine, covered in paint, and ruining the fine wood on the largest cabin in the ship. "It's my ship," Maebe reminded herself with a scowl. "It's your cabin now, Miss Sumine." He almost read her mind. "Do with it what you will. See to it that you don't disturb any of the men with personal requests again. They have work to be about, collecting orders that your father set about, and chasing all over the town trying to find paint for your whims isn't their first priority." Captain Hill's cool-headed response was met with a snort from Maebe. The newly painted desk in the middle of the room was designed to allow the captain and the navarch to discuss the movement of each ship in the fleet, locations of requested orders, and the places the navarch would need to visit personally. Each red ship's route for the following year would be planned out over the course of this trip. She unfurled the map of Nemain's western coast back under the strips of leather designed to hold it flat, and lovingly brushed a hand over the marks her father had left. Maebe had no intention of sitting around the table with Captain Hill any more than necessary. They would stick to her father's plans, pass on new purchases. She returned books and scrolls to the cabin, their dark covers and stained paper looking at odds with the clean white wood. An aged brown velvet curtain covered her bunk, with the dusky pink sheets that had been for her slightly smaller sleeping space, now sitting awkwardly on her new bed. Paint smeared along the edge of a small oval mirror fixed to the front of her storage cabinet, where she had clumsily dropped smudges of paint on it, then failed at wiping them away, leaving smears of translucent white across the expressionless face and sunken eyes that stared back at her. Every item she returned to the room was warm red, brown, or hues of yellow. Brass fixtures and bronzed artificer trinkets were scattered everywhere. It clashed horribly with what she had done, and she hated it, but at least it was different. This was no longer her father's space, even if her first act as occupant was to make it a horrific mess. 6 cities passed aboard Sumine 3, and a multitude of small towns between each of the major ports. Places of towering spires of black rock and huge flaming braziers lining the sweltering hot streets. Fighting pits infested the smaller towns, while the larger cities boasted arenas that hosted battles of a more prestigious nature. Fighting was a pastime for Nemanians. They took great pride in being strong and skilled, and turning that power on each other for sport. Those not raised in Nemain were seen as weak and unworthy, unable to compete for glory. Maebe had never watched the famed battles of Nemain. Forbidden in the most part by her father due to the barbaric nature of them. Many entered the arena for fame and wealth, but she had heard of its darker side. Smaller pits hosted executions of prisoners to the public, not just displays of strength. Criminal witches were stripped of their powers and pitted against a human to prove their innocence. If they killed the human, they would be executed as guilty. If they allowed the humans to kill them, that strength of conviction proved their innocence. She enjoyed the sporting chance of dancing around a courtyard trying to disarm Mouse, but the bloodlust disinterested her. The last stop on Sumine 3's journey was Camulus for the blood offering. Maebe had sped through each town, with each prearranged meeting done and agreed with a distracted lethargy. 2 traders had unexpectedly broken contracts with her, claiming there was no point making deals with a child. She assumed it was some kind of play to get her to beg after them and get a better offer, but she didn't speak up. The confidence she had in her trading skills had vanished like a sailor overboard in the ice tides. She couldn't be trusted to make any sound decisions. Not after what she had decided to do to certainly. She had stomped out of each of those meetings, and each time Captain Hill had returned to the ship an hour later to say that the deals were done and agreed upon using the terms set out by her father. He implored her to spend time building rapport and goodwill with those traders, to encourage continued business in the future. 3 times traders had tried to offer her appalling terms. A small chest of orange gems on top of the usual payment of gold for several bundles of high-quality Naihu pelts was a terrible trade, but she agreed to it through clenched teeth and a too-firm handshake. Most traders wished to be paid with crystals harvested from the Green Kingdom, but as much as possible the Red Seal deals were paid for with gold. If the pelts hadn't been on the requests for the year, she wouldn't have agreed. The second offer of blue crystals, charged to keep vermin from crops, in exchange for war witch blades, was a huge annual deal, one she could ill afford to mess up. Maebe had been meeting with a witch from the town of Wayland for over an hour, and was close to making the final agreement, when her hand floated to the chain around her neck. A tiny pouch was tied to the end of it, hanging under her shirt and sheltering a black crystal from the world. Doubt had jolted through her heart, and the room felt as though it had filled with water. Everything seemed to go slower around her. Voices drifted in her ears as the slurred language she couldn't understand. How can I trust this is right? I can't do this. I shouldn't be here. I can't. She had fled the meeting room in their inn, hoping no one would notice anything amiss, terrified anyone had seen how her hand clenched the front of her shirt, how sweat had dewed on her forehead and her breath had choked. In her private room, she had drawn the curtains closed and sat in the dark, unable to sleep or eat. Fear conquered her mind, roaming at will and stamping of any sense of ease that was foolish enough to surface. After what felt like too soon and an eternity, Captain Hill had barged into her room, his lowered voice filled with rage. What was that about? I didn't feel like we could agree. That offer is far worse than anything my father got, Maebe stuttered. She had sat on the floor, avoiding the chair or the bed. Captain Hill towered over her, blue-eyed scowl heavy under his sun-blonde hair and brow. Of course it is. They are aware that the military requests war guild blades every year. Your father spent years building a close relationship with Theric. This was the best we could have hoped for. But you knew that, didn't you? He snarled at her from his lofty height. I did. It was just a momentary sickness. I'm not quite feeling well, and I couldn't trust my judgment. She forced a smile to her face, and hoped her pallid skin would pass as some kind of sickness. Her hand was still clasped around the pouch at her neck. Right. He exhaled heavily through his nose. I'll get them to sign it as we agreed, and claim you are having a woman's turn then. I'll bring the contract over to you to sign once I've spoken to them. He glared at her as he spoke. Whatever this is, get over it. You have a duty to do. I don't mind stepping up in this circumstance, but I expected more from you, Maebe. With that he stomped out of the room, each step reverberating along Maebe's bones. The final merchant, who offered her questionable terms, Maebe's hand had slipped without thought to her chest. She had refused on the spot, leaving a room full of confused oil traders with the offer of the same contract as last year, or no contract. Captain Hill's contentious gaze followed her out of the room. By some alignment of the stars, it worked. There were no other traders from Green Kingdom. Limited options and luck sided with her. Poorer offers vanished as they continued sailing, with the word of an unyielding new navarch travelling ahead of them. An incredibly risky move. No doubt one they'll remember and try to make you regret, Hill had spouted at her one night in her ugly cabin aboard Sumine 3. I'm sure you'll be prepared for a fight next year. He raised a glass of fire spirit to his lips, but noticing Maebe hadn't responded, he continued speaking. I am sorry for your loss, for this. I realise it's a difficult task for you, and it's not ideal for me either. I will help you as much as I can because of the respect I had for your father, and I'll help you prepare for next year too. Maebe murmured something that sounded like an agreement. Fine, suit yourself. He drank the rest of his spirit with one gulp, and a pained wince before striding across the room to her door. Hand resting on the handle, he looked back at Maebe. I've seen how you were raised, and I know the work that you've put into learning everything as a daughter of the Sumine family. Your father was proud of you for a reason. Yes, it's not easy now, but in a few more years, you'll be a great trader. You've got the intuition for it. You demonstrated that with how you dealt with the wing whale oil traders. Then he left. Maebe grunted to herself. She had no intention of getting so lucky with her threat. She simply hadn't been able to face dealing with them, A wave of panic had caused her to flee. But instead of shaming herself, like she had with the blade merchants, she claimed a poor deal to cover her tracks. I'm a failure to my father's name. Chapter 27. Sumine 3 passed into Safe Bay. Black spires and huge fire-eyed crows from the southwest coast had abated in favour of the jagged red rocks of the waste. Exposure to sea breeze caked the red rocks and the coastal towns with shades of black and darkest brown. In the waste around Safe Bay, the dry air lifted the rock dust into the wandering clouds, leaving the black land tinted with the fiery red that lay beneath the surface. Camulus appeared in the distance. A crooked slate spire rose from the only temple in the city, dedicated to worshipping Cain, the god of fire. Humans and hedge witches dwelt in the main, both picked off by warlocks dwelling north of Mother Lake, under the rule of the War Witch Guild. The fickle wizard Ull was still battling for control, since she had unexpectedly been granted her position only 5 years prior. Sumine 3 sliced the water gracefully, and docked by the air-scorched buildings stretched out by the water. Lit torches burned night and day down the streets, lighting the masked faces of all who walked by. Masks were worn to protect the mouth and nose from sudden winds of the Black Desert, but it was forbidden to go about with a veil over the eyes in any of Nemain's towns and cities. The black iris and fire skin signified honourable strength as a blessing from Cain, but eyeballs like coal were the easiest way to identify a warlock. Black smoke cast into the sky by torches was offered to Cain in exchange for the strength to fight. Camulus was the closest city to Sachem Gorge, watched over by a fearsome city guard and surrounded by a huge black wall that skirted the edges. It was also one of the safest places in the main. The distance between Camulus and support from witches of the ruling guild left them to form their own impressive defences. The toppled Tower Inn sat close to the gnarled temple. Its interior black rock walls were marked with the brushed red fingerprints of guests. The common room held an enormous fireplace, empty as a desert pit at night. It would remain unlit in the heat of the day, but roar during the sudden cold of nightfall. Ashwood trees, made into spindly planks, composed all of the furniture inside the inn. Exquisite witch-made axes lined the walls, some with spent crystals affixed into the handle sockets. A hedge witch, gifted with musical training, was playing on a rounded harp by the void of the fireplace, a skin drum on the floor next to him, keeping tempo with the pulse of his magic. Maebe had spent each year at Camulus, trapped inside the ashy prison of the toppled Tower Inn, with a witch attendant. Her father had spent almost a week hiking to the gorge to offer his blood. The 2 years since he lost the use of his legs, he was carried on a palanquin, lifted magically by the witches who accompanied him. They made no other trades in Camulus, and it was always the final stop. "We have a room reserved for tonight," she told the stout man behind the bar as she pulled her scarf from around her nose and mouth. She knew dust had collected around her eyes in the same way it had on her travel companions. 2 guards from the palace, who would accompany her to Sachem Gorge and back. She knew their names, Arg and Fran, but lacked any desire to know anything else about them. They were loyal to the miserable king, who had sent her here without any time to mourn. "Sumine group, top floors reserved for your pilgrimage as always. Your witches arrived this morning," he grunted out. The innkeeper was broad, with a black moustache topping his burned skin, his grey apron marked with black dusty fingerprints. She followed the direction of his sun-baked hand and spied 2 jointed hats, rumpled from wear. One of the witches had several metalwork fingers, tapping on his jug with astonishingly lifelike movement. It marked them as the artificers that would lead her inland. Tomorrow they would meet with the 3 war witch warriors, and their company of 8 would leave for the gorge. Blackwood steps creaked in protest as Maebe traipsed up the stairs, leaving her guards to socialise with the artificers. Roast meat smells floated up from the kitchen behind the innkeeper and almost enticed her. She had lost most of her appetite since being at sea. Food was a chore that she couldn't be bothered to do. Upstairs, she hid in her room with the door bolted. She'd stayed in the same room before. A giant 4-post bed was carved to imitate the skyline out of the paned window. Spires erupted from the top of the posts to float above her head as she slept. Heavy black velvet curtains hung from the engraved wood, allowing her to shut out the rest of the room and shelter from the night's chill. A black fireplace was scrubbed clean. It seemed at odds with the dagger marks engraved on the surface of the mantle around it. Her own dagger appeared in her hand, and she stabbed it firmly into the soft wood, then stood back to watch the top-heavy blade vibrate back and forth with the force she had used. 1 floor below, steamy rooms filled with warm bathtubs tempted her to go and wash the city's dirt and sweat from her face. The effort of leaving the room and encountering other guests seemed like too much hassle. Maebe poured the provided jug of refreshing water down a drain pipe. She tipped some water in a bowl from her skin, and then left the rest to drink later. A precaution her father had taught her. Generations ago, several Sumine merchants were poisoned with water ingested in Camulus, planted by some rebels who had supposedly disapproved of the few artificers living in the main. They thought killing the Sumines would chase them away. The artificers and Green Kingdom guards gave the murderers the justice that the War Witch Guild granted them, if they could catch them. They could kill them or give them to the less venerable fighting pits. There wasn't enough of them left for the pits. The youngest nephew, the only person suitable for the blood offering, had been rushed south on a second ship to make the deadline for the king's burden. Maebe sighed to herself at the thought of her long-dead grandfather, several years younger than herself, rushing to do his duty in the face of his family being killed. My family was killed too, she whispered to herself. How did you do it? She left a loaded backpack by the door, with everything she would need for the next few days. Nestled in the bottom was a cloak as dark as the night sky. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it her first trip to Sachem Gorge. Her first blood offering. Sleep would evade her, as it had done every night since her father's death, but she curled up on the top of the bed anyway, slowly twirling a crystal that was as dark as the room around her. Chapter 28. Dawn kissed the sky with a fiery touch of the god so loved in Camulus. The heavens and the ground burned with matching colours. Cool black night being driven away in the face of another scorching day. The trek across the barren waste started early. 2 artificers, 3 warriors, and 2 human guards accompanied Maebe, trailing in a quiet line. Their dusty footsteps disturbing the burnt black surface to reveal the simmering red underneath, like dying coals. Maebe was wrapped in layers of light fabric to keep the dust from her face and hair. Loose, thin trousers with a calico pattern were tucked into light ankle boots as she held a tall ashwood walking stick. She kept her water skin tied to her belt, her dagger at the base of her spine, and her necklace pouch hidden away under her clay-coloured shirt. Dark dust caked everyone's clothing in the waist, even with the witches at the front of the line repelling the largest clouds. The pack beast, a stoneback ankylo, held their bags. The scaly creature waddled close to the ground on its 4 stumpy legs, following its artificer master. It demanded scratches behind its twitching ears from anybody close by, and rewarded them with an excited lick from a mouthful of yellowish slobber. Charred landscape was unavoidable. Long, loping hills added a varying angle to their hike, but the view of black-red rocks interspersed with crispy plants and dry, wiry trees never changed. At a sweeping glance, the waste seemed undisturbed by life. Several hours away from the city, Maebe noticed the lizards crawling from under sandy rocks, leaving secret paths of tiny red prints from their feet. Arachnes, desert spiders the size of a cauldron, lurked in crevices waiting for unsuspecting prey to wander past. Their fire eyes glowed within the depths of their lairs. Their route avoided the nests, but it did mean travel at night was foolish. During the burning light, black silk shimmered as it coated the ground ahead of dens, warning Maebe's group if any arachnis lurked nearby. Stepping too close could result in a venomous bite on their legs, ending with being paralyzed for several days. The gorge was a 2-day hike from Camulus. They were expected to arrive the following evening and leave after the blood offering. No sightseeing, no loitering, no business. It had always been the same. Make the offering and make for home. When dusk began to tint the horizon, the camp was erected by the artificers, complete with brass wards to keep the night creatures away, set at a perimeter. The warrior witches would take shifts guarding through the night, and the humans would rest in tents either side of Maebe's. Maebe vanished inside her tent as soon as it was prepared, without a backward glance. She had no interest in the devices raised around the camp, or her companion's stories. Laughter from the crystal fuel fire needled through the thin fabric of her tent beside her. Her keepers began a night of gossip in her absence, enjoying the lack of a sullen and sardonic human girl. As scheduled, they arrived at Sachem Gorge the next evening. Maebe had begun to doubt whether they would arrive in time as she had watched the sun slip down towards the horizon while the landscape remained unchanged. The huge canyon had appeared in the last moments of light, and the sight should have taken Maebe's breath away. Instead, she felt hollow, her insides carved out like the gorge itself. She sat back on a heat-blackened rock, dusting her clothes with the charred surface, and stared into the magnificent depths. Highlights shone in gold from the setting sun, stretched into a distance beyond imagining. She couldn't summon any feeling to the surface, above a layer of incertitude that had formed a cage over her every thought. "Miss Sumine," a questioning voice rang behind her. She turned to face a strange witch with dark brown, soulless eyes and heat-beaten skin, who looked to be near his middle years. Well over 200 then, she thought. He stood with his spine straight and proud. A version of the Green Kingdom's military uniform fit him perfectly, redesigned for the brutal heat of South Nemain. It still had a high collar and a belted jacket, but it was constructed of lighter material. His neat pointed hat cast his silhouette at an intimidating height. "Yes," she responded to his question, pulling her face scarf down in the absence of a choking breeze. The artificers stood at ease behind the newcomer. The others took it as their cue to relax. Arg and Fron peered curiously into the crevice that the witch had appeared from. "Many apologies on the sudden death of your father, miss. It's a pleasure to see you again, though." He smiled after he spoke, wrinkling his cheeks but never meeting his eyes. "Sorry, who are you?" Maebe questioned the insincere witch. "Apologies. I am Comage Ophis. I was assigned as your protector once, many years ago now. You were little more than a child, if I recall." He crooned, dropping into a deep bow, his soft voice carried between the burnt rock formations surrounding them. "I'm afraid I don't remember you," she offered him with a judgmental tone. "Ah, I must have been a boring guardian to such an energetic child then," he joked. His flinty eyes locked onto Maebe's, and she felt like a silk mouse under the gaze of a baby griffin, like she was going to be chewed with and left for dead just for fun. "Let us head into the canyon, shall we? You can take rest and refreshment, then be on your way again early in the morning. Best for both of us, I should think." He turned to lead the way between two towering rocks, vanishing behind them, and followed by the artificers, who gave him small nods and muttered formal greetings. They trod carefully down the steep steps. When the light became too dim in the depths of the gorge, each witch summoned a light in a different form. Arg and Fron stood close to her as the artificers produced crystal-powered lamps, and the warriors created orbs of light to float above them. By the time full dark conquered the land, they reached the bottom of the gorge. Led by Comage Ophis into a red-fronted cave carved deep into the canyon hills. A shudder ran through Maebe's body as she crossed the threshold. Looking up at the entrance, she saw it was guarded by what looked like two blue kyanite crystals. Whatever magic she had just passed, it had more effect on her than the throne room of the palace ever had. Past the entrance, the tunnels lost their natural formation, created by life within the canyon, and became clinically carved red hallways of rock untouched by the sun. No charred black surfaces, no carvings or tapestries, but pure simplicity. War witches would flaunt weapons and battle wounds, but their buildings usually lacked beauty and art. Plain constructs, built for people who desired only perfecting their skills, not their homes. She imagined this structure had been occupied by war witches long ago. It had only been loaned to the artificers who resided there, in exchange for hefty sums of crystals the king had paid to the war guild. Maebe's history lessons had taught her that the earliest Sumines hadn't always travelled to the depths of Nemain for their ancient kings. After the witch wars, the first of the Sumines offered blood in Elpis on the ocean. The area was later constructed into the docks, and once relations had been set up in Nemain, the Red Seal fleet allowed tradition to be mixed in with business. A small cut that Maebe would inflict on her hand would be offered as a blessing from the king, delivered by a family who represented their homeland and had proved their loyalty to their liege in those early years. In return for the blessing from the king and peace between humans and witches, Maebe would collect the king's burden. Maebe's loyalty was tested by being forbidden to open the crates containing the burden. She had theorized as a child that they had been empty, just a hollow gesture between two countries who shared a border with the infested lands. But she had once shaken one of the smaller wooden boxes and heard it rattle. During her first journey as a girl, she had learned that opening the crates would shatter her loyalty to her king, proving the humans of Green Kingdom were unworthy to rule themselves, and undoing the gift of protection the gods had left for humans. All symbolic nonsense, she knew. The gods had vanished. "Miss Sumine," Ophis said, bringing her wandering mind back to task. "Your chambers are here. I assume you've been taught the rules of the blood offering," he asked, staring down his nose at her. Maebe sighed in annoyance before spilling her answer out like a milk jug knocked on its side. "No leaving your chambers. If you have to leave, you can only do so with permission, in which case summon a servant to escort you. No questioning any witches in the gorge. No looking inside the crates containing the king's burden. No leaving without informing the Comage. You." She scowled up at him. "No." "Very well. I see your father went for the rote learning option. I just hope you understand the rules," Comage Ophis criticised. "Remember, these halls aren't as safe as your home. This is a country built by savage warriors. They are far safer if we know where you are." He pasted another unpleasant smile on his lips. "Would you like to join me for the evening meal?" No. Well, I had heard you were direct, Ophis chuckled. At least you want a simpering woman to cater to. I'd honestly have no idea how to treat you if that had been the case. Maebe released the sound before she could stop herself. Very well, Miss Sumine. I shall see you in the morning. Your human guards will be on the other side of your room, and a platter of food shall be brought to your chamber post-haste. With that, he twirled on his heel, causing his light clothing to float elegantly around him. Maebe shut the door on his shadow, and rested her forehead against the black wood. She gathered enough energy to bathe in the pre-filled bathtub, pleased to be removing days of dirt from her skin. The water was kept warm with a fire lit underneath the thin rock it rested on, creating as much sweat as she felt she was washing away. A servant witch came with a platter of finely sliced boiled roots and some form of roasted lizard, a delicacy for Maine. She lit each of the hundreds of tiny candles in the room with a sudden burst of power, leaving Maebe in the tub of blackened water to prepare herself for bed. I'll remember to bring Elsie next year, she murmured to herself after the servant shut the door to her chamber. Finally free of dust from her hair and skin, Maebe tossed herself onto the black furs and soft blankets made from the fine-scaled waste lizards. Her room was modest, a heavily draped bed, and a black desk with a washroom and an open chamber to one side. Long metal stands held candles from ceiling to floor, a wall of flame opposite her washroom. For just a second, she closed her eyes to the flickering sting of Cain's flames, and found her hand had reached underneath her shirt and rested on the pouch fastened around her neck. How can I make this right? Her thoughts drifted from certainly guilt to her father, sorrow. What she had to do in the morning, fear. Eventually, she completed her emotional spectrum by landing on the king's order to be married off to somebody in the autumn. Mouse? Was it too late to take the king's permission for that person to be Mouse? She had wanted to see him, hear his reassuring voice and his immature charm. She had refused him for a foolish reason before, and yet, in Clest, he had still given her a reason to smile. He had gone into the woods with her, and she had told him a clumsy truth. She did want him. Then he slept beside her. Warmth at the memory flushed her in the firelight. He chased everything away. When her mind landed on him, it fixated and drifted. He was comfort. He wanted to be around her. He wanted her. Her loose fingertips slipped lower, brushing her navel and slipping between the sensitive skin at her hip bone and the band of her loose nightwear. Teeth grazed her bottom lip, neck arched slightly with anticipation she was savouring. She turned from her side to rest comfortably on her back, and as she did so, the weight around her neck shifted and tapped against her breast. Ugh! She growled, sitting upright in bed and scowling down at the black pouch holding the crystal. Trust you to ruin it. Glistening light shone on her skin from the heat of the candles still dancing around her chamber. It would take forever to blow them all out. The thought of another sleepless night plagued with heat from all those tiny flames was too much. Fresh air and privacy presented the first glimmer of motivation she had felt in weeks of hiding herself in a tiny cabin. The door swung inward at her touch, and she peeked her head out into the corridor to see if it was empty. A draught swept in. Goose prickles spotted her damp skin at the sudden chill. She rummaged through her pack to find something dark to sneak through the halls in. Only one item would cover her fully. Certainly his cloak. She buckled her dagger around her waist, muttering complaints to herself as she worked the small catches. It's not safe in the halls, Miss Sumine, mocking Comage Ophis' tone. Well, I have magical blades. See if I can't protect myself against some stupid arachnes. They're only knee-high. She used her practiced impression of Neris. Oh no, don't bite my delicate ankles. Useless. She swung the door open again, letting the cold air of the night prickle her skin before wrapping in the dark fabric of Certainly's untouched cloak. She had every intention of following the route Commage Ophis had shown her to the main entrance of the maze. Just a taste of clear night air, a cold breeze that hadn't been trapped underground for centuries, and a glimpse at the stars to clear her head. A moment alone, and away from the eyes of men who needed to be aware of her location at all times. At the first crystal-lit turn, she knew to turn left. She peeked her head to see if the corridor was deserted before stepping out. It was empty, so she placed one foot forward and was struck with a strange sensation. The chain around her neck was pulling her, tugging her right. "Cert?" she questioned in the dark, heartbeat stumbling over the name. Silence answered her, but the pull at her neck remained. Against every instinct, she followed the crystal, knowing it was pulling her towards something. If it was something to undo what she had done, something to get Certainly back. Again at the next junction, she clasped the crystal in the hidden pouch, and again it throbbed when she turned left. On and on through the maze of red rock tunnels lit with brass artificer lanterns at each corner. She felt herself pulled faster, further. A glance back and a sigh of annoyance as she realized she couldn't remember the way. Still, the crystal pulsed in one hand, and the other brushed across the coarse sandstone of the cave walls. Light bloomed in the distance of the tunnel. She was following the pulling until it stopped. "Useless piece of," she mumbled, before stepping into the chamber ahead of her. Out of the darkness of scarcely lit tunnels, she flinched at the bright lights around her. A balustrade formed an arch just ahead of her, carved from the rough stone of the cavern. It looked like a viewing platform. The tip of the largest crystal she had ever seen shone wickedly in front of her. She had to peer over the edge to see the base of the huge crystal. Its size was unfathomable. As tall as the magical front doors at the Artificer Guild, and as sharp as the point of a stiletto blade. A wide cavern sheltered it, with one entrance on the ground and a selection of strange artificer devices lining the lower parts of the wall. The depths of the crystal looked to be clear, almost glowing with inner iridescence. An abundant structure left tiny gem growths at the base of the massive point in front of her. Opaque shadows darkened the core, blurred out by clouded impurities that had formed around the contamination. The surface looked to be ruddy and smeared, as though it had been dragged through sludge by some giant who had half-heartedly tried to wipe it clean after. She couldn't tell what colour it was supposed to be. She had studied the growth of crystals at some depth, so whilst it was surprising to see a crystal of this size growing outside of the crystal mines in Clest, it wasn't impossible. Even in the mines, she was fairly certain that they'd harvest any crystal before it could grow to this extent. Even a quarter of the size would have been sold for a fortune, and would have taken a team of witches to charge it with some kind of use. Crystallization would take form on any rough surface in the mines. But to grow this, it must have taken centuries, and a good supply of magical salts to nurture it. Guess that's why the Artificer Witches moved here, she thought. Muted voices echoed from the bottom of the chamber, and Maebe dived behind the half cover of the balustrade. Glimpses of two witches, marked by their hats, walked into her view. Sounds of them chatting to themselves drifted around her. She shifted onto all fours, careful not to crunch the sandstone under her light boots, and watched them walk across the huge chamber. Commage said they can take an extra barrel tomorrow. Order's been given that we're supplying north now as well. Echoes of the first witch drifted up in snatches that made sense when Maebe focused on the words. That means double, right? How, They passed the crystal without even sparing a glimpse for the magnificent creation, and walked behind it, out of Maebe's eyeline. Shit, she cursed to herself. I need to go. Just as the thought whispered through her brain, a muted wail sounded from below. Maebe scrambled along the stone, peeking through the gaps to find a spot she could see through. At the farthest edge, face pressed between two pillars, she saw the witches opening a room. A cell. Metal bars clanged as the door slid along the floor. One witch magicked a catch over it to hold it open. Inside, cowering humans in filthy clothes, avoiding the gazes of the witches holding the keys. "Which one?" said the first pointed figure. Chapter 29. Terrified sobs clawed their way up to Maebe's hiding spot on the stone balcony. Dark clusters of shapes formed into humans, too many for Maebe to count at the awkward height she was spying from. The witch with a red band tied around his hat, it reminded Maebe of blood, grabbed at the woman closest to him. The scared lump flinched from his grasp, and yelped her fear as she tried to claw back into the huddled crowd. Magic must have seized the woman. She lifted onto her toes, knuckles clenched with terror, as she was dragged backwards towards Bloodband, bound with invisible bonds. Maebe could just make out the tear tracks streaking the filthy woman's face. "Take me instead," a deep voice pleaded. The man that threw himself in front of the woman's path was as dirty as the rest of the prisoners, dusted with layers of the cave's sandstone, until some of them looked like they had been carved from the walls themselves. The man was grizzled and exhausted despite his chivalry. Shining gold thread on his chest caught Maebe's attention, gleaming through the filth. She knew that sigil. She had seen it almost every day since she was a child. It was the crest of the Green Kingdom, embroidered into a military jacket. The man was a soldier of the Green Kingdom. He would have worked and fought alongside the artificers, like the ones who were holding the keys to his cell. "Whatever," snapped Bloodband. The woman drifting towards him was shoved with unseen hands back into the cell with a screech. The tall soldier stepped outside of the bars, squinting beneath a raised hand at the crystal lights of the cave. The metal door grated shut with a soul-shivering grind. The woman, who had been tossed back inside, banged into the bars with a painful thud, screaming for the soldier. The blonde witch raised his hand, and the woman swiveled in the cell and collapsed on the floor in a heap. No one edged forward to help her. "I hate it when I have to bind them with magic too, don't you? Always leaves me drained after," complained Bloodband. "Not me," laughed the blonde witch. "Oh, shut up. Just because the Commage let you at a few humans," scowled Bloodband. "What?" Maebe mouthed the word. Warlock. She couldn't see from her vantage point, but she was certain that neither of the witches beneath had the coal-black eyes of a warlock. They were only magic users, not takers. But he had said he had taken human life in exchange for power. A yelp of shock almost escaped Maebe's lips as the wall beside her hiding spot panged with the release of a rope. In all four corners of the cavern, hidden ropes appeared at Maebe's height and lowered to the ground from winches. The shackled ends were summoned into Bloodband's hand with his raw power. The soldier had his wrists and ankles strapped into the long ropes and was led to a metal platform, tripping over his fetters with shaking legs. Bloodband placed his hand on the small lifting crystal, and they shot up into the air. The platform sliding swiftly up the brass rod bolted to the wall. Maebe flinched back from their ascension, trying to remain unseen on her side of the chamber. The platform remained lower than the tip of the crystal, which partially covered Maebe's view. She clasped a hand over her mouth as she watched the soldier. He was levitated above the crystal point by Bloodband's magic, ropes on his wrists and ankles dangling. Fear made his eyes bulge from his head, but he refused to make a sound. "All right, tighten the winches," Bloodband called to the blonde witch still on the ground. With the whirring of artificer machinery, the cords fastened around the man's ankles and wrists and were pulled taut. Then the soldier let out a gasp of distress as he was released from the magical grip, dropping several inches without support from the witch, just above the sharp point of the crystal. The skin on his hands began bleeding from the pressure of his constraints. His muscles were bulging and tearing from the force of the shackles, yanking him in 4 directions. Fists balled, and head flopped forward with its own weight. "Got it!" came a shout from the ground. "Yeah, we good. Everything ready down there?" Bloodband called back. Hang on." Moments passed, with the pained grunts of the soldier sounding over the witch on the ground, banging something metallic. Bloodband indifferently stretched his arms over his head and looked bored. "All right, that's down, and I've found a scraper. You keep him steady and I'll start the winchers," called the ground witch. "Finally," complained Bloodband to himself. His hands raised up in concentration, and the soldier froze again, minor relief flooding his face as the pressure was taken off his joints. Then the whirring started. Slow, flowing movements of the winches, following a metal trail in the walls to the ground, lowering the human onto the pointed crystal. Not releasing his weight, but the slow descent to pull him lower. He didn't scream, at first. Not when the crystal pierced his gut, and the first trickle of streaming blood ran down its surface. Blood, Maebe realized, as she started to tremble and sweat. The dirt on the surface of the crystal was blood. Blood of other people. The scream broke from the soldier's lips as the crystal pierced through his back, punching through him, glistening red in the harsh light of the cavern. Bile rose in Maebe's throat. So slowly he was being lowered, his snagged flesh sticking to the crystal that was tearing him apart. The screams he released curdled Maebe's blood, and terror cradled her. She wanted to run, but all she could manage to do was throw her head back against the wall of the corridor and cover her mouth to keep from screaming or vomiting. Noisy breaths escaped from her nose, and she squeezed her eyes shut. Bloodband was beginning to sweat, holding the man still as he was slowly torn in two. His power would falter, and the soldier would manage to flail and shout even louder until a final, gargled cry pierced the room. "I'm letting go," came an exhausted call from Bloodband. And the human corpse swung in 2 parts across the room. Head and shoulders swung to one side, legs to the other, innards raining down into the metal troughs the witch on the ground had placed above him. The metal platform lowered Bloodband to the ground, where he picked up a curved pole with a strip of leather tied to the end. He began scraping the blood from the surface of the crystal with downward strokes, and his companion was shifting it with magic, moving the coagulating blood into the brass barrels. It was changing too fast to be natural, red fading to deep brown. Meticulously he scraped each facet. Maebe dared to peep through the edge after the silence fell. Tear-blurred eyes made out parts of the man left hanging from each side of the room, while the witches went about their grim task. They worked for several minutes, their grunting noises drifting up to Maebe, who had brought her breathing under control. In, out. In, out. She was building up the courage and energy to run back and find her room somehow. She knew she couldn't ask anyone for help, not with fear in her eyes, that she couldn't hide, nor the tears streaking down her face. She rested her hand on her chest to feel the slowing of her heartbeat. Her palm pressed onto the lump under her shirt. I have to make it right. That's why she brought me here, Maebe thought. I have to stop this. It's payment for being such a wretched person to certainly, and for being a horrible daughter. I have to do something. I give my blood to these people, she realized. Why do they need my blood? Resting on all fours, she just had the energy to force her shaking body to stand, and then she managed to pull herself upright. When she arrived on her swaying feet, the metal tang of her own blood from biting her tongue and the stench of human death hit her. What fleeting strength of will she had gathered deserted her. Laughter echoed from beneath in the chamber. I'm sorry, she mouthed to the room before turning her back on the crystal. I can't do this. From the corner of her eye, she saw the second witch getting on the platform with another human prisoner. Maebe's eyes widened. A girl, a filthy, skinny child, shivering beneath a torn dress. Ankles and wrists in the oversized shackles, splattered with the blood of the soldier who died before her. Stop! Maebe screamed as loud as she could, startled by her own strength. Her fingernails dug into the crumbling balustrade. She had no idea what she was doing, or if they would stop at her command. If they would put her in the cage with the others, she just knew she couldn't stand by as it happened to that child. Both witches swung their heads up. In the direct light shining from above, she saw that neither had black eyes. In an instant, pain thrummed through the back of Maebe's head, black swimming along the edge of her vision, her legs bending towards the sandstone cave beneath her. But she fought to stay up. Oh, shit, came a startled female voice from behind her. Sounds of commerce erupted from the cavern as Maebe turned. Confusion and instinct caused her to lift her hands to her face. Too late. Pain flashed through her nose, and she collapsed to the floor in a heap. Chapter 30. Somebody screamed. Maebe couldn't see it, but she could hear the mixed sounds of fighting, whirring gears of artificer machinery, and cries of anguish. It wasn't the sound of a child screaming, but a man. The soldier. I can go and save the soldier, fluttered through Maebe's unfocused brain. She felt a jarring pain in her face, through her nose. Small, strong hands were bruising her wrists, her shirt and cloak bunched over her shoulder, back shredded across the rough ground. No, you can't. He died. You left him to die. She remembered watching him, doing nothing to help. She was going to leave them all to die. Whoever was holding her let go, so Maebe slipped with a jolt in her heart. She recognized the sound of a sword being drawn before her tender head slammed into the ground, wavering her already fading consciousness. Sourceless sounds faded in and out of her dizzy awareness. Go! Go, go! We don't have time to fuck about making her comfortable, roared a furious female voice sometime later. Are all the prisoners out? Came a calmer male voice. Maebe recognized their tongue. They were speaking in Nemanian. All of them, heading into the East Mountain. Lurs has them, shot the woman. Who is this, anyway? Questioned the male. Maebe felt a toe nudge her rib. The new Sumine, the woman's reply was cold fury. Maebe felt a hot glob of spit land in her face, but the only response she could manage was to loll her head away from the source. The ground shifted beneath her, flowing in a zigzag motion. Membranous leather snapped beside her ear. the noise and movement calling her back into the senseless darkness. Cold. Drowning. Water dashed in Maebe's face. She threw herself upright with a scream of panic. The flash of pain that tore through her head reduced her back into a curled heap, fingers tangled in her hair as she pressed her palms to her scalp. Semi-dry blood was crusting at the back of her head by a tender gash. "Give us one reason why we shouldn't kill you," came the man's voice from before, with a thick accent over his greeny uncommon. Maebe's eyes creaked open, sticky with damp road dust, not quite washed away by the water tossed over her. She took in the man. His skin was as red as the wastes he lived in, his hair as grey as ash, in a warrior tail down his back. He was dressed in the light leather of Lemanian fighters, hidden beneath swaths of fabric, and shadows of the dark cabin she was inside. "Give me one reason why you would kill me," she fired back with a pathetic croak. Not the tone she was aiming for, but she managed a full response in Lemanian. "You're a Sumine, aren't you?" he grunted, switching back to his native tongue. "Yes," she cut back, falling silent as the man's blade appeared in his hand and darkness flickered in his deep brown eyes. Wait, that's no reason to kill me. I'm here on King's business." She lifted her hands in deference, unbound. She wriggled and felt the blades had been removed from their sheath at the base of her spine. "If you're a Sumine, then you're as murderous as the witches in the canyon," he said with certainty. "I've murdered no one, sir. My family is the Sumine trading family, sent to trade with witches in the main, just for magical items that go within the laws of the Green Kingdom." Her voice was hoarse, but she pushed through the pain in her face, renewed with every word. She met his eyes. Something almost softened in his face. "Papa, she doesn't know, just like Al said." It was then that Maebe noticed the girl, of an age with her. She moved to stand beside her father with fluid grace. They had the same ruby skin, a sign they had been raised in the waste and touched by Cain's fire. Her hair, black as Arachne's web, left a straight cascade about her shoulders. Her dark eyes shimmered with attenuating hate. "Shh, child," the man turned to the young woman with tenderness. "Your brother was right, but that doesn't mean you should have left her alive." "Well, what do we do then? Kill her now that we know she's as ignorant as Olive Green? Why not just kill everyone?" The girl sulked back. "What do you suggest? Keeping her as a pet?" "I am no pet," Maebe snarled, before fear could still her tongue. She couldn't focus on their words for long, without a throb pulsing through her head and distracting her. But she wasn't going to sit in silence and let strangers decide her fate. "How do I kill you then?" hissed the girl in perfect Greenian, drawing Maebe's own knife from behind her. Maebe started at her fluid language, her weapon in the hands of someone else. "Never," warned her father. "The moment has passed for that action." The girl, never, paused and moved away to pick her nails with Maebe's beloved blade. "You truly have no idea what being a member of the Sumine family means, do you?" she asked in Nemanian. "Being a Sumine means you're a trader. My father travelled the main for decades, buying magic items. My family hasn't done anything," Maebe argued. "Then why do you go to Camulus? I've asked around the city. Your family has never brought anything from there," Neva's father asked. "And why should I tell you?" Maebe growled through her failing voice. The man didn't respond. He turned away from Maebe. His daughter flicked Maebe's blade up in the air and caught it, and shot her a threatening grin. When the man turned back, he offered Maebe a glass of water, but held it just out of her reach when she leaned forward to take it. "It's not like it's a secret," Maebe croaked out with a scowl. "You could ask anyone in Camulus." He continued to stare at her. "We trade along the run of cities and towns on the west coast, finishing at Safe Bay within Camulus. There we collect the king's burden, at King Jasic's request. A tradition of sorts, a peace offering between humans and witches. Then we sail back to Elpis and hand it over to the king's personal witch guard. Done." He stretched out and handed her the water, which she sloshed down her front, in a rush to drink it all before he could take it away. "That confirms what we heard, father," Never muttered. "What is this king's burden that you collect?" She asked Maebe from over her father's shoulder. "I've never looked in it. You're not supposed to." Maebe shrugged. She dropped her empty cup on the floor and watched it roll along the dust-covered wood, eyes locked on the girl holding one of her daggers. "Never told me what she saw back there. She was going to kill you until you shouted out to stop. You saw the sacrifices taking place, and you tried to intervene, didn't you? She said you looked horrified, as though you didn't know." Maebe's eyes widened at the carnage hidden beneath her pounding head. "That crystal, that has nothing to do with me, I swear. I swear I didn't know. If you're going to kill me for that, you need to know I know nothing." "Let me tell you a story, Miss Sumine," the man cooed. "I want to see if this scenario is familiar to you." He shifted to sit at a level with her, a pained gaze fixed onto her. "2 years ago, our village, a tiny place, hidden deep in the wastes, was destroyed. Dozens of my neighbors and friends were taken by the witches who burned our houses to the ground, including my wife. My mother," interrupted Never with a snarl. "My son, my daughter escaped with me, but we saw my wife taken by a band of witches wearing unfamiliar uniforms. Not the black leathers of the warriors who roam the wastes from the war guild, and not the dark robes of the warlocks. We tracked these witches across the wastes until we reached that place in the canyon where we found you. And do you know what we saw there?" Maebe shook her head, rattling the pain around, not disagreeing with the man. She knew what was coming, knew why they had been in that cavern last night, but wanted to deny it with all her heart. "We saw the people who lived beside us, sacrificed on that crystal and discarded. My wife, my love, tossed aside like pieces of ruined meat. And you know what we heard." His voice was soft. Maebe raised her head to look at him, saw the pain hiding beneath him and the fury warping his daughter's expression. "We overheard the witches say that Sir Sumine had left for Camulus, and that the blood offering had been successful that year. We sped to Camulus as fast as we could, with every intention of killing this Sumine, but the ship had already left." Hot tears slid down Maebe's pained cheeks, leaving tracks in the dirt. 2 years ago was when she had last come with her father. She would have been sat at the inn, bored, whilst these people suffered so much. "I have a theory," he continued. "Artificers have lived in the gorge for centuries. I wonder how many small towns, how many lone travellers have become the victim to your king, and it has been blamed with such convenience on warlocks. We went to our own guild, the defenders of this land, to be turned away. We were told it was warlocks trying to frame our peaceful allies, that no one would help us. But we know what we saw, and we know whose name is bathed in the blood of my wife. I am not falling for the excuses of a weak wizard, he growled. Never crept closer to Maebe, her warm breath caressing Maebe's damp cheeks. Did you know? No, I swear I didn't. I'm sorry. I know the term blood offering. That's all I know. It's the offering of Sumine blood. It's just a little cut on our hands. It's symbolic. Maebe sobbed back. Did your father know? She asked, mirroring her own father's cool tone. My father was a good man. Did he know? Shouted Never's father. I don't know. I really don't. Maebe blubbed into her hands. Never stirred and backed away, muttering with her father in the corner. They cast meaningful glances back to Maebe, whose crying was beginning to fade. She knew she should focus on her breathing, but the pain in her head was growing stronger, her thoughts faltering. It was too much to digest. You have 2 options, Lady Sumine, called the Nemanian man. Maebe didn't even see the point in correcting him. Never strolled over to her crumpled form on the floor. First option, I kill you now, Never threatened. Maebe's crisp still held aloft. You said you offer your blood in the canyon. If your blood is worth something to these witches, killing you removes whatever it is that they need. We heard in Camulus that you were the last Sumine. No doubt your blood is offered as some form of consent, though I understand little enough about blood magic to know how or why. And that's why I give you option number 2. Never smirked. If you no longer want the deaths of innocent people in your name, of course I don't, Maebe fired. So you wish to see an end to this too? Never asked. Certainly. I only want to make things right, she thought, holding her hand over the lump by her chest. Never squatted on her heels and stared at Maebe in deep judgment. Maebe held herself steady against the constant pain in her head and the forceful gaze of the young woman in front of her. Then come north with me. If you're here on royal business, I'm guessing that you have been to the palace, yes? Help me and my brother break into the castle, so we can have a little chat with the king. Chapter 31. Maebe awoke from a fretful sleep. She had dreamt of the huge crystal, of blood dripping down its smooth surface, reflecting her face back at her. When she wiped the blood away with a leather rag, it streaked down her pale silk dress, a red stain spreading out along the fine fabric. And when she looked up to clean the crystal some more, Certainly's face stared back at her from within. No smile, blood smeared across her features and clothes. No smile. She looked like death. Maebe opened her eyes to the chill of night camped in the wastes of Nemain, stars hanging overhead showing the month of the Sphinx. Never was stretched out on a blanket beside her, wrapped in warm sheets and a lizard skin. Maebe traced her fingers over the motifs of constellations depicted on the edge of Certainty's cloak that she had been using for a blanket. They had set out from Never's hidden camp west of the canyon 3 days prior. Never's father had yanked on Maebe's nose, setting it straight, after the wild girl apologized for breaking it. She had claimed it was Maebe's own fault for not going down with her first strike. They had given her a vile potion, which sped up her healing, including making the scabs form and fall off her back and face at an alarming rate. 2 silk wings, giant waist lizards, were coiled around them, sharing their stored heat and protecting the women riding them across the waste from other night creatures. Never's family had bred them in their old lives. Their spines flowed side to side as they ran, skittering across the flat, rocky landscape with surprising agility. They would gather up speed and then glide across the ground with flaps of skin between their front and back legs, barely connecting to the earth once they reached their maximum pace. They were so different to the pack beasts that had accompanied Maebe into the gorge. They were bigger and slimmer and longer. 2 bulbous eyes of metallic shades sat atop discoidal heads, which would swivel around, taking in the surroundings through instinct, not intelligence. Maebe's silkwing was called Ashern. He had a yellow stripe along his bronzed body, darker tips on his rounded toes and nose. Maebe knew she wouldn't be going back to sleep, but from the narrow strip of light creeping along the horizon, she realized they would have been waking up soon to leave anyway. Never had loaned her a set of light leathers for riding, a dark red tunic with wide leather buckles up the middle, and a black scarf to wrap around her head and face that billowed behind her as they ran. The flaps of leather over her knees, shins and forearms were protection in case her silkwing threw her off. The layers were stitched to allow a breeze to form a tunnel onto her skin when they were travelling fast in the hot wastes. "You don't sleep so well, do you?" mumbled Never from her bundle of blankets. "It's nearly dawn. Get up," Maebe replied in Greenian. Never rolled over, pulling the gliding flap of her silkwing tighter. The huge lizard lifted its scaled legs, expecting a stomach scratch. "Curse balls! Every trained fighter I've ever met has been just as lazy," Maebe groaned at her. "Shh!" Never sat up, scowling at Maebe through tangles of loose hair. Her silkwing, fire dust, stood at the disturbance and readjusted into a better position. "Don't call for the god of death in the wastes." "Oh, no, you're not superstitious, are you?" Maebe asked, fastening her leg leathers on with unimpressed incredulity. "No, not superstitious. Just it's better not to mess with things you can't understand," she argued. "So, what do you say if not—" She mouthed the insult at Never again, causing her to scowl further. "If you must know, we say Cain's cock," Never informed her. "Cain's cock? That's no better," Maebe objected. "It is an insult. It is supposed to sound insulting, but Kerr isn't the god of these lands, so we don't summon him," Never snarled, rolling her eyes. "Only idiots summon death on themselves." She gave up on going back to sleep and began to put her riding leathers on. Maebe fished dried bread rolls from her borrowed pack and started to pick up breakfast. "Kerr isn't the god of the Green Kingdom either," Maebe retorted. She had started to like Never. She was angry with the world, and Maebe felt a kindred rage flickering inside her. She had also dedicated the last 2 years of her life to rescuing people from the gorge. They had saved everyone alive from the night they took Maebe. Never was a person who was fighting to make things right. Death blesses humans with short lives. The Green Kingdom is the kingdom belonging to humans, and therefore death, Never informed her with religious wisdom. "Nonsense. I know the stories of the lands. Cain gave fire to Sumine to forge strength in the heat of the Red Land." "Very true," smiled Never. She was proud of her home. Every child in Sumine used a weapon at some point. It was common for learning skills with blades and bows to be favoured over reading and writing. Never had whispered stories of her childhood to Maebe in the night, of how she loved the bow and excelled in target practice. Her brother preferred the sword, like their father, so they chased each other with sticks even outside of the training ring. "Okay, Cain, fire. Kappa blessed the sand dragons with a river when Cain's fire blew east and dried their lands into a desert. an Artio, gifted witches who fled to the eastern coast with a forest rich with bounty. There the refugees of Cain's heat grew strong in. They grew strong in nothing because they fled like cowards, claimed Never, over her last mouthful of crunchy bread, a skewer of some unnamed lizard jerky in her other hand. You ever been there? Maebe asked Never's scowl before continuing. In the north, Oreed raised mountains from the ground so that he could reach his love who had hidden amongst the stars. My home sounds much more romantic, Maebe cooed at Never, who had raised a haughty eyebrow at her. But Green Kingdom, she started, is part of Oreed's empire of the mountains, Maebe filled in. That is not true, though. Humans tried to tear Oreed apart, leaving the curse of death scarred into the land using magic. So feel free to petition your god in your kingdom, but please do not mention him in the wastes. Never folded the last of her blankets and strapped them to Ashen and Firedust. Point taken. Although I haven't heard that part of the verses before, Maebe said, brushing the crumbs off her clothes from breakfast and offering most of her dried roll to Ashen, his long tongue wrapped around Maebe's hand and wrist, coming away leaving nothing in her palm. Of course you haven't, but it is the reason the humans of Nemain choose to stay here, and why I will always come back to Nemain. Only stupid or weak humans seek death in the name of safety. That just doesn't make sense, Maebe replied. You were too weak to defend yourself from me at Sachem Gorge. Never mounted Firedust's narrow saddle with a swift hop of her leg over the flat lizard and waited for Maebe to do the same thing. A thin layer of glass padded with leather sat over Never's eyes, making her look like one of the Silkwings. Without witches to ward away the inland sandstorms, they had to protect their eyes with goggles large enough to see through. Okay, so give me my blades back. Teach me, Maebe demanded. Never had kept her daggers, leaving Maebe unarmed for the journey. Just because Maebe had agreed to go north with her, she didn't trust her enough to let her carry a weapon. Now you think I'm stupid enough to give you your blades back, or you want to prove you aren't weak. Either way, I think you are too stupid to learn. With her last comment, Never grinned wickedly at Maebe, and set off on Firedust, heading north with the sun cresting over the horizon to her right. Cain's cock, Maebe hissed as she hopped onto Ashen and set off behind her. Too long had she shut herself away, hiding from the world, when she should be setting it ablaze, to destroy all trace of wrongs done in her name. Riding through blistering days with Never, she could wear the mask of that new person. They slowed the Silkwings down with the fading of light. For the entire day they hadn't spotted one of the many inland villages for Never to go and top up their supplies. Maebe was staying away from towns, and keeping her hair wrapped in the southern style. A dip in the gradual incline of the earth let them be hidden from the horizon. They had to remain vigilant against warlocks until they reached Fumo Forest. It's easy if you know how, claimed Never, with an arrogant smirk. Stay west of the gorge, travel fast and keep any camp hidden. Waste drakes are nocturnal, so warlocks won't even travel at night. Maebe pulled up beside Never, wiping the dust from her goggles, using the corner of her scarf, and yawning underneath. Here's a proposal. Teach me to fight like you, and I will be so tired that I'll sleep through the night, Maebe offered as Never finished wiping her own face. So, my student is showing a grain of wisdom after all, Never grinned at Maebe. Student? Maebe asked. You can have your blades back if you land a single blow on me, Never laughed, hopping from Firedust Black, and squirting a skinful of water into the creature's mouth. His head tilted side to side with enjoyment as his strange eyes swiveled in different directions. Maebe slipped out of Ashen's saddle and threw a swift fist to the back of Never's head. Somehow the dark-haired girl caught her hand and twisted, causing Maebe to drop to her knees or let the bones in her arm snap. Never sneered down at her and twisted a little more, until Maebe cried out. Please, You didn't think it would be that easy. Never let out a delighted laugh and let her go. Before Maebe knew what she was doing, she chuckled too. Just a small sound that escaped her lips. The last time she heard such a noise was with Mouse in Clest, in a world that seemed cleaner than the one she sat in. The word traitor flared in her brain, along with the smile. But as long as happiness was paid for with her own pain, she knew she would smile. She kneeled in the dirt, an ache heating her shoulder and elbow, laughing with the girl who put her there. Let's settle the silk wings, then we can do a little hand-to-hand before it's too dark, invited Never. Just because I want to keep hold of your knives doesn't mean I don't want to sleep until dawn tomorrow.